She was 5 or 6, standing in the root cellar beside her mother. The air smelled like damp clay and vinegar. Her mother's hands were wet to the wrists, pressing shredded cabbage into a brown stoneware crock with both fists, knuckle deep. A stone lid waited on the shelf. "Why does it not rot?" she had asked. Her mother did not look up. "Because we keep the air out." 25 years later, that answer was the only thing standing between her cattle and a winter that would kill thousands of them across the northern plains. The Willow Knife place sat on 160 deeded acres where the Niobrara bottoms flattened into sandgrass and clay bluffs. And in October of 1886, it looked like what it was, a small ranch losing a fight with time. Calla Whitcomb had buried her husband in July. Nathan had been cutting slough hay in the south meadow when the mower team spooked at a rattlesnake, bolted left, and rolled the cutter sideways into a draw. The tongue snapped. The sickle bar caught him across the ribs and hip before the whole rig pinned him under 600 pounds of iron and oak. A neighbor found him before sundown, but by then there was nothing to find except a man who had stopped breathing in the grass beside his own half-cut hay. He left her the land, the house, 2 hay racks, a roofed shed, a dug well that pulled sweet water in summer and silty water in fall, and a note from the First Territorial Bank of Valentine saying the winter interest was due by March 1st. He also left her 38 cattle, 12 cows, 9 yearling heifers, 8 steers being finished for a spring sale that would now come too late, 6 calves born that April, 2 bulls, and 1 old cow named Juniper, who had survived 4 Nebraska winters by sheer stubbornness and a refusal to drift with the herd when the wind changed, 2 saddle horses, 1 draft mare with a swollen left foreleg that made her limp on cold mornings, $11 in cash after paying the fall freight bill, and a winter coming that would kill more cattle across the northern plains than any event in the history of American ranching. Calla knew the math. She had known it since the day she watched 2 men lower Nathan into clay soil on the bluff above the creek, and she had known it every morning since, standing in the doorway of the house he had built with milled pine and hand-split shingles, looking at cattle that needed more feed than she could give them. The summer had been dry. Not the worst drought anyone remembered, but dry enough that the grass came up short, cured early, and crumbled when you walked through it in September. The slough hay Nathan had been cutting when he died yielded less than half what a normal year produced. Calla finished the cutting herself, 12 days of work that left her hands so raw she wrapped them in flour sack cotton every night, and stacked what she got beside the shed. 8 tons. She had 8 tons of poor slough hay, gray-green and stemmy, and 2 tons of straw that Miriam Pike's husband had let her haul from their threshing site for the cost of a day's labor. A mature cow in winter needed roughly 25 to 30 pounds of roughage a day to maintain condition. 38 head, 8 tons of hay. The arithmetic was not complicated. It was just fatal. She had feed for 30, maybe 40 days if she rationed hard. Winter in the upper Niobrara country lasted 5 months in a good year. In a bad year, it lasted until the grass greened in late April or early May. She was short by 4 months, at minimum. Ephraim Vale rode on to the Willow Knife place on the 14th of October. The same day, the first hard frost turned the pumpkin fields at Ash Hollow Crossing into a carpet of collapsed orange pulp. Vale was 57 years old. He had ridden trail from Texas to Montana 3 times, managed cattle through the winter of 1880 to 81 on the Yellowstone breaks, and served as foreman of the Broken Spur outfit since 1883. The Broken Spur ran 4,000 head across open range that stretched from the Niobrara to the Snake River bottoms, and its owner, a man in Omaha who had never set foot on Nebraska grass, trusted Vale's judgment about weather, cattle, and survival more than he trusted his own bankers. Vale did not come to help Calla. He came because Nathan Whitcomb had owed the broken spur $8 for fence wire purchased the previous spring, and Vale wanted to settle the account before winter made travel difficult. He tied his horse to the post beside the haystack. He looked at the stack. He pulled off one glove, reached into the hay at chest height, and drew out a handful. He rubbed it between his fingers. He smelled it. He let it fall. Then he walked the corral fence. He counted the cattle. He looked at the draft mare's swollen leg. He looked at the house, the shed, the hay racks, the well, the empty space where a second stack should have been. Calla watched him from the doorway. She did not invite him inside. She had learned in 3 months of widowhood that men who walked your property before speaking to you were measuring something they intended to use against you. Vale came back to the haystack. He jabbed his glove into it again, deeper this time, and pulled out a fistful of stems that crumbled between his fingers. "How much is here?" he said. 8 tons, Calla said, "and 2 of straw." 8 tons! He said it the way a doctor repeats a symptom, not surprised, confirming. "You have feed for 30 days if the weather smiles," Vale said. He put his glove back on. "Weather does not smile here. I know how long it lasts." "Do you?" He looked at the cattle again. 38 head, 12 cows, some of them bred, calves that cannot drift, steers that will lose weight every week they stand here instead of selling. He paused. "Mrs. Whitcomb, you are looking at a dead herd." The words landed like a fence post dropped on frozen ground. Calla felt them in her chest. Not because they were cruel. Vale was not a cruel man, but because they were the same words she had been telling herself every night since August, and hearing them from a man who had wintered cattle for 30 years made them real in a way her own fear had not. "I am not selling at $9 a head," she said. "You may not get 9 come January. Then I will feed them through." Vale looked at the haystack one more time. With what? The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Calla did not answer because she did not have an answer. Not yet. She had a feeling, a pressure behind her ribs that was not grief and not panic, but something closer to stubbornness, and she had a memory that kept surfacing at odd moments, like a bubble rising through still water. But she did not have an answer. Vale settled Nathan's fence wire debt for $5 instead of 8 because he was not heartless and because he knew she would need the $3 more than the broken spur would. He mounted his horse, touched his hat, and said one more thing before he turned toward the river road. "Sell before November. You will get more than you get in March, and in March you may have nothing left to sell." He rode north. Calla stood beside the haystack with $5 less than she had started the morning with, and the knowledge that the most experienced cattleman in the district had just pronounced her herd dead. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table. She put her hands flat on the wood and stared at the wall where Nathan had tacked a collection of clippings, notices, and handwritten notes, the accumulated paper of a man who believed that reading about better methods would eventually make him a better rancher. Most of the clippings were about fencing, water rights, and breed selection. One was a recipe for horse liniment, one was a notice about a land auction in Cherry County, and one, yellowed, torn at the corner, cut from an Illinois farm journal sometime in 1884 or 85, used a word Calla had seen before but never thought about until this moment: ensilage. The clipping was short, 3 paragraphs from the Prairie Farmer or something like it, describing a method by which green fodder could be preserved in a pit or trench, packed tight, sealed from air, and fed to cattle months later. The author mentioned a Frenchman's book. He mentioned dairy farmers in New York and Illinois. He mentioned that the fodder soured but did not spoil, and that cattle ate it readily. Nathan had circled the word ensilage in pencil and written in the margin, "Ask Hendricks about this." Hendricks was a dairy farmer near Norfolk who had moved away in 1885. Nathan had never asked. Calla read the clipping 3 times. Then she put it down and thought about her mother. Her mother had kept a root cellar in Keokuk County, Iowa, and every September she had packed crocks with shredded cabbage, salt, and whatever else she was preserving: beets, green tomatoes, small cucumbers. The method was the same every year: shred, salt, pack tight, weight the lid with a stone, wait. Calla remembered standing beside her mother in the cellar, 5 or 6 years old, watching her press cabbage into a brown stoneware crock with both fists. The cellar smelled like damp clay and vinegar. Her mother's hands were wet to the wrists. "Why does it not rot?" Calla had asked. "'Cause we keep the air out," her mother said. "Air is what ruins it." That memory, the wet crock, the sour smell, the stone pressed down on the wooden lid, had lived in Calla's mind for 25 years without purpose. It surfaced now with the force of something that had been waiting. Air is what ruins it. She looked at the clipping again. Green fodder, packed tight, sealed from air, soured but did not spoil. She looked out the window at the haystack. 8 tons, 30 days. Then she thought about the pumpkins. The frost that morning had been hard enough to kill the squash vines at Ash Hollow Crossing, the loose collection of farming homesteads 3 miles south, where settlers from Iowa and Illinois had broken sod and planted corn, millet, and garden crops. Among the garden crops, several farmers had planted pumpkins, partly for household use, partly because pumpkins grew fast in Nebraska soil and could be sold to townspeople and freighters at 2 cents apiece. 5,000 pumpkins, give or take. A good crop, a profitable crop, until the frost. A hard October frost did not merely damage pumpkins, it collapsed them. The cell walls burst, the flesh went soft, the skin cracked and wept. Within 2 days, a field of bright orange pumpkins became a field of sagging, leaking, sour-smelling pulp that attracted flies and smelled like something between cider and decay. The farmers needed the mess gone. Pumpkin rot drew vermin, fouled the soil for spring planting, and stank badly enough that Miriam Pike's husband had threatened to burn the field if it was not cleared by the end of the week. Calla rode to Ash Hollow Crossing on the 15th of October. She brought her wagon, her lame draft mare, and $3. She did not want the good pumpkins. She wanted the ruined ones. The logic assembling itself in her mind was not complete. It had gaps she could feel, like stepping across a creek on stones that might or might not hold weight. But the shape was there. Pumpkins contained sugar, even ruined pumpkins. She had tasted frost-killed squash before. It was sweeter than fresh, because the cold converted starch to sugar before the flesh broke down. If the pumpkins were left in the open, they would decay. Flies, mold, black rot. Useless. But if they were crushed, packed into a trench, layered with dry material to absorb the moisture, weighted, and sealed with clay, the same principle as her mother's crocks, the sugars might ferment instead of rot. The mass might sour into something stable instead of something poisonous. The pumpkins alone were too wet. She knew that instinctively. 80% water, maybe more after frost damage. You could not pack wet mash and expect it to behave like cabbage in brine. You needed dry material to balance it: straw, chaff, old hay, even dried grass swept from the threshing floor. And you needed to keep the air out. Calla did not know the word anaerobic. She did not know about lactic acid bacteria or pH levels or the specific chemistry that turned plant sugars into organic acids. She knew crocks. She knew that her mother's sauerkraut kept for months under a stone lid, and she knew that the same cabbage left uncovered on a shelf turned black in a week. The principle was the same. The scale was different. A crock held 2 quarts. She needed to preserve enough feed to supplement 38 cattle for 4 months. She needed a trench. At Ash Hollow Crossing, 3 farmers stood beside the ruined pumpkin field, arguing about whose responsibility it was to clear the mess. The air smelled sweet and foul at the same time, fermented sugar and vegetable decay, thick enough to taste. Calla pulled the wagon beside the nearest row of collapsed vines and said she would take every pumpkin in the field, ruined, split, leaking, frozen, soft, all of it. Irwin Pike, Miriam's husband, a lean man with a permanent squint from years of wind, looked at her wagon, looked at the field, and said, "Take them where?" "My place." "For what?" "Feed." Pike exchanged a look with the other 2 farmers. One of them, a young German settler named Feld, laughed. Not meanly the way you laugh when a child says something that reveals how little they understand about the world. "Mrs. Whitcomb," Pike said, "these are not feed. These are garbage. My hogs will not touch them after 2 days in the sun." "I do not want them in 2 days. I want them now." "You want to feed rotten pumpkins to cattle." "I want to buy them. $3 for the field." The number changed the conversation. $3 for something the farmers were about to burn anyway. Pike looked at Feld. Feld shrugged. $3, Pike said. "And you haul every last one. I want this field clean by Saturday." Calla paid him. 3 of her $11. She now had $8, 38 cattle, and a contract to move 5,000 ruined pumpkins 3 miles over a sand road with 1 wagon and a lame mare. A boy standing by the fence held his nose as Calla loaded the first forkful of collapsed pumpkin flesh into the wagon bed. Orange pulp dripped through the boards and left a trail on the road that would still be visible 2 days later. Miriam Pike found Calla on the road between the pumpkin field and the Willow Knife place, driving a wagon that smelled like a root cellar in August. Miriam was 26, sharp-featured, practical in the way that farm wives became practical when kindness was a luxury and winter was not. She walked beside the wagon for a quarter mile before speaking. "Irwin says you bought the whole field." "I did." "He thinks you've lost your mind." "He may be right." Miriam looked at the wagon bed. Pumpkin mash sloshed against the sideboards. Seeds floated in orange water. The draft mare's hooves were stained the color of rust. "A crock of cabbage is not 38 cows," Miriam said. Calla did not ask how Miriam knew what she was thinking. Farm women in the Niobrara country shared a language of survival that did not require explanation. If Calla was buying ruined produce and hauling it to her ranch, the reason was either madness or preservation, and Miriam had spent enough time around crocks and cellars to guess which principle was at work. "You are right," Calla said. "A crock is not 38 cows. That is why I need a trench." "A trench? 60 feet long, 6 wide, 8 deep in the center." Miriam stopped walking. Calla kept driving. After 30 yards, Miriam called out, "You cannot dig that alone." "I know," Calla said. She did not turn around. Miriam stood in the road and watched the wagon disappear over the rise, trailing orange water in the ruts. She did not help that day. She did not help the next day either. But she did not tell her husband that Calla's plan involved a 60-foot trench and a theory about fermentation, because some things you keep to yourself until you know whether they are brave or foolish. Royal P. Kress arrived at the Willow Knife place on the 19th of October, 4 days after Calla bought the pumpkins. Kress was 44, clean-shaven, and wore a wool coat that had been tailored in Omaha. He operated as a cattle buyer, informal bank agent, and middleman, the kind of man who appeared wherever money and desperation intersected, carrying an offer that sounded generous until you examined the numbers. He bought distressed cattle at steep discounts, held or resold them, and lent against land at rates that made the bank's terms look charitable. He had been watching the Whitcomb situation since Nathan's funeral. Cress tied his horse at the corral post. He did not look at the haystack, he looked at the cattle. 38, he said, as if confirming an inventory. I am not selling, Calla said. She was standing beside the trench site she had marked with stakes, 60 feet of clay rise, the ground already scarred where she had cut the first 2 feet of sod with a spade. Mrs. Whitcomb. Cress removed his hat and held it against his chest, which was the gesture he used when he wanted a person to feel that he was being sincere. I am not here to argue with a grieving woman. I am here because I can see what is coming, and I do not believe you can. You can see 8 tons of hay and 38 head. So can I. Then you can see that the arithmetic does not work. The arithmetic is my concern. Cress walked to the trench stakes. He looked at the raw clay. He looked at the wagon parked nearby, still streaked with pumpkin pulp. He smelled the air. What is that? He said. Pumpkins. Pumpkins? He said the word the way a man says the name of a disease he has heard about but never seen. I'm told you bought 5,000 ruined pumpkins from the Ash Hollow field. I did. For $3. That is correct. Cress put his hat back on. The sincerity gesture was finished. Mrs. Whitcomb, I can offer you $9 a head for the herd. Today. Cash. That is $342. Enough to settle Nathan's note, pay your freight bill, and leave you with passage money to wherever you have family. My family's buried in Iowa. Then to wherever you choose. I choose here. The silence between them was different from the silence with Vale. Vale's silence had been diagnostic, a man measuring a situation and finding it hopeless. Cress's silence was transactional. He was calculating how much longer to wait before the price dropped. $9 is generous for cattle in this condition, Cress said. After the first blizzard, I will offer 6. After the second, I may not offer at all. Then do not offer at all. If you cannot meet the March payment, the bank will recommend foreclosure. You understand that? I understand it. And you intend to feed 38 cattle through winter with 8 tons of hay and a wagon load of rotten pumpkins. The way he said it, flat, precise, and calibrated to make her hear the absurdity, was the most dangerous thing about Royal P. Cress. He did not bluster or threaten. He stated facts in a sequence that made the listener feel foolish for disagreeing with the conclusion. Calla felt it. She felt the pull of his logic like a current in creek water, steady and patient and moving in one direction. $9 a head, $342. Pay the note. Leave. I intend to feed them through, she said. Cress mounted his horse. He did not touch his hat. He said, I will be back in March, Mrs. Whitcomb. One way or another, I'll be back. He rode toward McVeigh's store, where by evening the story would be retold in 3 versions, each more pitying than the last. The Whitcomb widow had spent her last money on ruined pumpkins and was digging a grave-sized trench on a clay rise. And someone ought to tell her people, except she had no people left to tell. If you have ever been laughed at for building something nobody else understood, tell us in the comments, because what Calla did next is the reason this story exists. The trench work began on the 20th of October. Calla started at dawn with a shovel, a mattock, and the draft mare hitched to a scraper blade that Nathan had built from a split log and 2 iron straps. The The clay rise she had chosen sat 40 yards behind the shed, on ground that sloped gently south toward a gravel seep where runoff could drain without pooling. The site was not accidental. Clay soil packed better than sand, held moisture out better than loam, and could be cut into blocks for sealing. Calla had watched Nathan choose post-hole sites by the color of the subsoil, and she chose this site the same way, by getting on her knees and pressing her thumb into the ground until she found clay dense enough to hold a shape. 60 feet long, 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep at the center, sloped to 4 feet at each end. She scratched the outline with the mattock and began cutting sod. The first day she moved 112 cubic feet of earth. She knew because she counted the scraper loads, 9 loads, each roughly 12.5 cubic feet. At the end of the day, she had a shallow depression the size of a large grave and hands that wept clear fluid from 3 burst blisters. The trench needed to hold roughly 2,800 cubic feet. At 112 per day, she needed 25 days of digging. Winter could arrive in 30. The margin was thin enough to cut skin. She marked progress on the shed wall each night with a carpenter's pencil. October 20th, 112. October 21st, 127, she had learned to angle the scraper blade for a fuller bite. October 22nd, the mare's forelegs swelled badly enough that Calla unhitched her at noon and shoveled by hand for the remaining 4 hours of daylight. 91 cubic feet that day. She fell behind schedule. Each evening she hauled pumpkins. The field at Ash Hollow Crossing was 3 miles away, and each round trip took 2.5 hours with the wagon loaded and the mare limping. She could manage 2 loads per day if she sacrificed sleeping hours. Each load carried approximately 40 pumpkins, split, leaking, half frozen by morning, and thawed to orange soup by afternoon. She dumped them beside the trench in a growing pile that attracted flies, smelled like vinegar, and drew looks from every rider on the river road. 6 loads hauled, she wrote on the shed wall after the first 3 days. 34 to go. Her hand split along the callus lines. Her shoulders burned. She ate salt pork and cold biscuits standing beside the trench, because sitting down meant she might not stand again. The cattle watched her from the corral with the patient, empty attention of animals that do not understand urgency, but sense it in the movements of the person who feeds them. On the 24th of October, 4 days into the digging, the sky changed. A line of gray cloud moved in from the northwest, low and flat, pressing the air down until the grass lay still and the birds went quiet. Calla looked at the sky and felt the arithmetic shift. She was not halfway through the digging. She had hauled fewer than a quarter of the pumpkins, and the weather was turning. The first snow would not be the killing snow. First snows in the Niobrara country were often light, a dusting, a reminder, a warning. But the first snow meant the second was closer, and the third, and the hard freezes that would turn her clay trench into something she could not dig with any tool she owned. She had days, not weeks, days. That night she lay on the bed in the dark house and listened to the wind testing the eaves. The cattle shifted in the corral. Somewhere south, a coyote called and received no answer. Calla stared at the ceiling and thought about Vale's words. You have feed for 30 days if the weather smiles. She thought about Cress's words. One way or another, I will be back. She thought about the trench, half dug, surrounded by a pile of rotting pumpkins that no one in the Niobrara country believed could become anything other than what they already were. And she thought about her mother's hands pressing cabbage into a crock, and the stone lid settling into place with a sound like a door closing. Air is what ruins it. She had to finish the trench before the ground froze. She had to haul the remaining pumpkins before they decomposed beyond use. She had to layer, pack, seal, and cover before the first hard freeze locked the clay into iron. She had days. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. The snow came on the 26th of October. Not the killing snow, a thin, dry powder that blew sideways across the grass and melted by noon, but it turned the clay trench into a slick trough that swallowed Calla's boots to the ankle and made the scraper blade skid instead of bite. She lost a full day to the mud. 112 cubic feet became 43. The walls of the trench wept brown water that pooled at the center and had to be bailed with a bucket before she could dig deeper. By nightfall, her skirt was soaked to the waist and stiff with clay, and her arms trembled when she lifted the lantern to mark the shed wall. October 26th, 43. Behind by 69. She could not afford another day like it. The 27th brought cold air behind the snow, sharp, dry, the kind of cold that tightened the ground and cracked mud into plates. Calla was in the trench before dawn, and the frozen surface gave her something the mud had taken away. Resistance. The mattock bit into stiff clay and held. The scraper blade cut clean furrows. By noon, she had matched her best day's total, and by the time the sun touched the bluffs, she had moved 141 cubic feet, her highest mark yet. She wrote the number on the shed wall and allowed herself to eat sitting down. The rhythm established itself over the next 5 days. Dig from first light until noon, haul pumpkins from noon until dark, tend the cattle in the remaining hour of twilight, eat, sleep 4 hours, repeat. The cattle needed checking, water troughs freezing at the edges. Hay rationed into piles small enough that the stronger cows could not hoard from the weaker ones. The calves watched for signs of scour or chill. Calla's body registered the cost in a ledger she could not see but felt in every joint. Her hands split and healed and split again along the same lines until the cracks became permanent features, pink and raw as new scars. Her lower back seized every morning until she had been moving for an hour. She lost weight she could not spare. Her dress hung loose at the shoulders, and the belt she cinched each morning needed a new hole punched with an awl. By the 31st of October, the trench was 2/3 dug, and the pumpkin pile beside it had grown to a mound the size of a small haystack, orange and brown, and leaking into the grass. 18 loads hauled, 22 to go. She was going to run out of time. Matthias Boudreau arrived on the 1st of November with a broken wagon axle and a question. He came from the east, driving a freight wagon loaded with salt, leather tack, and flour sacks bound for a store in Valentine. The left rear axle had cracked where an old repair had weakened the hickory, and the wagon sat canted at the edge of the river road a quarter-mile from Calla's gate. Boudreau walked to the nearest ranch, which was the Willow Knife place, and found a woman standing chest-deep in a trench, swinging a mattock into clay. He was 62 years old, French-Canadian by birth, raised near Trois-Rivières, drifted west through Wisconsin dairy country and Illinois farm towns before hiring on as a freight hand running goods between Omaha and the Black Hills. He was short, barrel-chested, and walked with a hitch in his left hip that he blamed on a mule kick in 1879. His hands were the hands of a man who had done every kind of labor the plains offered, scarred across the knuckles, thick at the palms, the nails cracked and dark. He stood at the edge of the trench and looked down at Calla, who looked up at him with the expression of a person who has been interrupted in the middle of something too urgent for interruption. "I need an axle repaired," he said. "I have tools, I have a spare timber in the wagon, but I need a place to work and a fire to heat the iron straps. I will pay or I will trade labor." Calla climbed out of the trench. She looked at his hands. She looked at his boots, which were the boots of a man who walked as much as he rode. She looked at the road where his wagon sat tilted under its load. "You can use the shed," she said. There is a forge pit behind it. Nathan's tools are on the wall. And the payment? Help me dig. Boudreaux looked at the trench. He looked at the pumpkin pile. He looked at the raw clay walls, the water pooling at the bottom, the scraper blade leaning against the near wall with mud caked on its edge. What is this? He said. A trench. I can see it as a trench. What is it for? Calla hesitated. Every time she explained the idea, she heard how it sounded. A widow with a theory about cabbage crocks and ruined pumpkins, building something that no one in the territory had seen work. She had stopped explaining to the neighbors. She had stopped explaining to herself. She just dug. But Boudreaux was not a neighbor. He was a stranger with a broken axle and no stake in her failure. Silage, she said. The word landed differently than she expected. Boudreaux did not laugh. He did not squint or shake his head or exchange a look with someone who was not there. He tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he hears a sound he recognizes from a long time ago. Ensilage, he said. He pronounced it with the French vowels, ensilage, and the word sounded, for the first time in Calla's hearing, like something real instead of something clipped from a newspaper. You know what it is, Calla said. It was not a question. I have seen it tried, Boudreaux said. Near Elgin, Illinois. A dairyman named Phelps built a timber box 12 feet square and filled it with green corn and clover, packed it with horses, covered it with planks and stones. Did it work? Some of it. The top spoiled, the middle kept, the bottom was too wet. He paused. He fed the good portion to his cows, and they milked through February. Calla felt something shift behind her ribs. Not hope, exactly. Hope was a word for people who had time to feel it, but confirmation. The principle worked. Not always, not perfectly, but it worked. Someone had done it. I'm using pumpkins, she said. Pumpkins. Boudreaux walked to the pile. He picked up a collapsed pumpkin the size of a man's head, squeezed it, and watched orange water run between his fingers. He smelled it. He tasted the liquid on the tip of his tongue, then spit. Sweet, he said. Too sweet and too wet. How much dry material do you have? 2 tons of straw, some frosted millet I cut along the creek, whatever hay sweepings I can gather. You need more dry than wet. The Elgin man's mistake was too much moisture at the bottom. If the liquid has nowhere to go, it pools and the rot starts from below. I plan to slope the bottom toward a gravel seep. Boudreaux looked at her. It was the first time she saw the expression that would become familiar over the next 2 months. A kind of careful recalibration, the look of a man adjusting his estimate of someone he had undervalued. Show me the slope, he said. He repaired his axle in 2 days. He stayed for the rest of the autumn. The partnership that formed between Calla Whitcomb and Matthias Boudreaux was not charity. Boudreaux said so himself on the 3rd day, when Calla tried to thank him, and he cut her off with a sentence she would remember for the rest of her life. I'm not helping you because you are a widow, he said. I'm staying because you are doing something I saw fail once, and I want to see it done right. The distinction mattered. Charity created debt. Curiosity created partnership. Boudreaux was not a generous man moved by pity. He was a practical man moved by the knowledge that he had watched Phelps's silage half succeed in Illinois and had thought about the failure points for years without having a reason to test his theories. Calla gave him a reason. They worked out a division of labor in the first week. Calla dug. Boudreaux hauled. In the evenings, while the light held, they laid the first layers of the trench together, and it was in these sessions that Boudreaux taught. He did not teach by lecturing. He taught by doing, and by making Calla do, and by showing her the difference between what she thought was right and what the material demanded. The first lesson was packing. Calla had planned to fork the pumpkin mash into the trench and tamp it with a shovel. Boudreau watched her do this for 10 minutes, then climbed down into the trench, picked up a forkful of mash, and squeezed it in his fist. Air bubbles rose through the orange pulp and popped at the surface. "Feel this," he said, and handed her the compressed mass. It was dense, wet, and warm. "Now feel this." He scooped a forkful from the layer she had tamped. It was loose, spongy, and cool. "Air," he said, "trapped in every gap. You're building a trench full of air pockets, and every pocket will heat, and every heated pocket will rot." "How do I get the air out?" Boudreau climbed out of the trench and unhitched the draft mare from the scraper blade. He led her into the trench carefully, because the footing was uncertain and the mare was lame, and walked her back and forth across the first layer of pumpkin mash and straw. The mare's hooves sank 4 inches, then 6. Pulp squeezed upward between the straw. The layer compressed from 8 inches to 3. When Boudreau knelt and pressed his hand into the surface, no bubbles rose. "Horses," he said. "Walk them over every layer. Pack it until you cannot push your thumb through it. If you can push your thumb through, it is not packed." The second lesson was moisture control. Boudreau sliced open a frost-killed pumpkin and held the 2 halves over the trench. Water poured from both pieces in a steady stream that lasted 5 seconds. "How much of this is water?" Calla asked. "Most of it. 8 parts in 10, maybe more after the frost cracked the cells." He dropped both halves into the trench. "If you fill this trench with pumpkin mash alone, you will have a pool of liquid by December and frozen sludge by January. The cattle will not eat it. Nothing will eat it. The straw absorbs it. Some, not enough." He looked at the straw pile, the small stack of frosted millet, the hay sweepings Calla had gathered from the threshing floor at Ash Hollow Crossing. "You need every dry thing you can find: straw, millet, corn stalks, chaff, hay dust, even dried grass raked from the prairie. Every layer of pumpkin must sit between layers of dry material, and the dry must be thick enough to take the moisture without going slack." He built the first complete layer to demonstrate. Straw and willow brush at the bottom for drainage. A 6-inch layer of crushed pumpkin mash spread evenly. A 4-inch layer of chopped straw mixed with frosted millet. Another layer of pumpkin. Another layer of straw. He walked the mare over each addition until the surface was dense and tight, and the color was a mottled orange gold, like wet leather. "The pumpkin feeds the ferment," Boudreau said. "The straw carries the moisture. Together they become feed. Apart they become garbage and bedding." He tasted the pressed surface again. "Sugar," he said. "Enough sugar and the right bacteria will make acid instead of rot. The acid preserves. That is the principle." "How do you know when it has enough acid?" "You will smell it. Good silage smells like vinegar, sharp and clean. Bad silage smells like death." The third lesson came 2 days later, and it was the one that mattered most. Calla had sealed the first 15 feet of the trench with a layer of clay 6 inches thick, cut from the trench's own walls and packed with the flat of a shovel. She was proud of it. The surface was smooth even, and firm to the touch. Boudreau walked the length of the sealed section, knelt at 3 points, and pressed his palm against the clay. At the third point he pushed, and his hand sank 2 inches before meeting resistance. "Too thin," he said. "It is 6 inches. 6 inches of clay is not a seal. It is a suggestion." He stood and looked at the trench. Air does not need a hole. Air needs a weakness. 6 inches of clay will crack when it dries. It will crack when it freezes. Every crack is a door, and every door lets the rot in. How thick? 3 feet in the center, sloped like a roof so rain and melt run off instead of pooling. Then sod blocks over the clay. Then boards. Then stones. 3 feet of clay. That was more digging, more hauling, more days she did not have. Calla looked at the sky, which was the pale, empty blue that preceded November cold, and felt the margin shrink again. "We do not have time for 3 feet," she said. "You do not have time for a trench that fails in January either." He was right. She knew he was right. The argument was not about thickness. It was about the difference between doing something and doing something that worked. They compromised. 2 feet of clay in the center sloped to 18 inches at the edges. Sod blocks cut from the trench spoil, dried for 2 days in the wind, and laid over the clay like bricks. Boards salvaged from Nathan's broken hay rack, weighted with the largest stones Calla could roll from the creek bank. The fourth lesson was feeding discipline, and Boudreaux delivered it before the trench was even half full. "When you open this trench," he said, "you will be tempted to cut deep. You will have hungry cattle and a pile of feed, and you will want to pull as much as you can. That is what feed is for. That is what feed is for if the feed is hay. Hay sits in air and does not change. Silage sits in a seal, and the moment you break the seal, the air enters and the rot begins." He drew a line in the clay with his finger, a narrow vertical cut across the width of the trench. "You cut a face, 2 inches deep. No more. You feed what you cut that day. Tomorrow you cut 2 more inches. You never leave the face open. You never dig in from the side. You never pull from the middle. 2 inches. 2 inches. And you cover the face with a wet sack or a board when you're finished. Every hour the face sits open, you lose feed." Calla thought about 40 days of feeding, 2 inches per day across a 6-foot wide trench, working down from the surface. The math was tight. The margin between enough and not enough was measured in inches of discipline. "And if the top layer is spoiled?" she asked. "It will be. The top 6 inches will be black. Cut it away and do not feed it. What is beneath will tell you whether the trench worked." November arrived with wind. Not snow, not yet, but a constant pressing wind from the northwest that dried the ground, cracked the clay, and made every hour of outdoor work feel like a negotiation with something that wanted you gone. The grass flattened. The cattle turned their backs to it and stood with their heads low, conserving energy they would need more of before the season was finished. Calla and Boudreaux worked through the wind. The trench was 2/3 full. The pumpkin pile shrank as they layered, packed, and sealed, but the pace was slower than the calendar allowed. Each layer required hauling, spreading, mixing with dry material, packing with the mare, and testing, Boudreaux on his knees, pressing his hand into the surface, saying, "Again," or "enough." The setbacks multiplied. On the 3rd of November, a rainstorm filled the open section of the trench with 4 inches of standing water. They spent an entire day bailing with buckets, Calla from the trench, Boudreaux from above, and lost the work of the previous 2 days. The bottom layer in the flooded section had gone slack and loose. They had to dig it out and repack it. On the 5th, a group of boys from Ash Hollow Crossing rode to the trench at dusk and cut one corner of the clay cap with a shovel they had brought from home. Calla found the damage by lantern light, a wedge of exposed silage, already darkening where the air had reached it. She repacked the corner with fresh clay, then sat beside the trench in the dark and held the lantern until the flame burned down to nothing, because she did not trust the boys not to come back. On the 8th, Miriam Pike appeared at the Willow Knife place, not to help, to demand. "Irwin wants 2 of the $3 back," Miriam said. She stood by the corral fence with her arms crossed and her chin set in the way that meant she was delivering her husband's message, not her own. "The pumpkins were sold," Calla said. "I hauled them. The field is clean." "He says you cheated us. You found use in waste, and the profit should be shared." "The profit is a trench full of something that may or may not be feed. If it fails, will he refund me?" Miriam's mouth tightened. She had no answer to that because the answer was obvious. Irwin Pike would not refund a penny, and they both knew it. "Tell him no," Calla said, "and tell him his straw is still in the pile, and if he wants it back, he can come haul it himself." Miriam left, but something in the exchange, the stubbornness of it, or maybe the exhaustion in Calla's face, or the sight of the trench now 3/4 full with its clay cap rising along the sealed sections like the spine of some buried animal, changed something in Miriam Pike. She came back the next morning, not to talk. She drove 3 wagon loads of straw to the edge of the trench, unloaded them without speaking, and said one sentence before she left. "If this turns bad, I never came." Calla used every stalk. The final confrontation before the trench was sealed came from Cress. He did not come to the Willow Knife place. He went to Boudreau. Calla heard about it secondhand, Boudreau told her that evening, his face set and his voice flat in the way it became when he was angry and controlling it. Cress had found Boudreau at McVeigh's store, buying salt for the trench layers. He had offered Boudreau $20 to leave the Willow Knife place and continue his freight run to Valentine. $20 was more than a month's wages for a freight hand. The offer was not subtle. "He said you were wasting your time on a widow's delusion," Boudreau told Calla. "He said the trench would rot, the cattle would die, and anyone associated with the failure would carry the reputation." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd seen silage keep cows alive through February, and that I would rather waste my time proving it could work than spend his money proving it could not." Calla looked at Boudreau across the kitchen table. The lamp between them threw shadows up the wall. His hands were folded around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "He will not stop," she said. "No." "He wants the herd cheap and the land cheaper." "Yes. And if the trench works, he gets neither." Boudreau drank the cold coffee and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. They both understood what Cress was, and they both understood that understanding him did not make him less dangerous. A man who profits from failure does not need to cause it. He only needs to wait. Yesam, by the 12th of November, the trench was full. 60 feet of layered pumpkin mash, straw, frosted millet, corn stalks from Ash Hollow Crossing, hay sweepings, dried creek grass, and prairie chaff compressed by the mare's hooves, packed by Boudreau's fists, and sealed under 2 feet of clay sloped like a shallow roof and covered with sod blocks, salvaged boards, and stones hauled from the creek bank. The final seal took 2 days. Boudreau insisted on walking the entire surface, pressing his hand into every section, checking for soft spots where the clay had not bonded to the sod beneath it. He found 3. They dug them out and repacked them. Then it was done. Calla stood at the south end of the trench and looked at what they had built. It did not look like feed. It looked like a long, low mound of dirt and sod, unremarkable, the kind of thing you would walk past without noticing. The only sign that something lived beneath the surface was a faint smell, sweet, sharp, somewhere between cider vinegar and wet grain, that rose from the sealed edges when the wind died. Boudreau stood beside her. He did not say it would work. He did not say it would fail. He said, "Now we wait." Waiting, Calla discovered, was worse than digging. The trench settled through the second half of November. The clay cap sank 4 inches as the material beneath compressed under its own weight. Boudreau said this was normal, healthy even, and that settling meant the layers were bonding, the moisture was redistributing, the sugars were doing whatever sugars did in the dark without air. Calla knelt beside the trench every morning and smelled along the edges. Most of the seal held tight. The air that escaped was sharp and clean. Vinegar, Boudreau had said. Good silage smells like vinegar. But one corner smelled different, not vinegar. Something thicker, darker, the smell of vegetable matter breaking down in the wrong direction. Calla showed Boudreau. He dug back the clay at the damaged corner, the same one the boys had cut, and found 6 inches of blackened material where the air had penetrated before the repair. They cut away the spoiled portion, about 30 pounds of ruined feed, repacked the cavity with fresh straw, resealed it with wet clay pressed flat, and covered with a double layer of sod blocks. Boudreau said the rest of the corner smelled right. Calla pressed her face to the clay and inhaled until she was sure. The early data was thin but real. No steam rising from the main body of the trench. Steam would have meant heating, which meant aerobic decay, which meant failure. No flies after the first hard freeze. Flies meant rot. No flies meant the seal was holding. The clay cap remained tight except for the one repaired corner, and the cattle nosed toward the trench when the wind shifted. Calla watched them from the corral, heads up, nostrils flared, testing something on the air that their instinct recognized as food even through 2 feet of clay. But the trench was a sealed box, and the only way to know what was inside was to open it. And opening it meant committing. Once the face was cut, the clock restarted. Not the clock of winter, but the clock of air, the same enemy that had shaped every decision since the beginning. Calla was not ready to open it. Not yet. She had hay left, diminished, rationed but present. She would feed hay as long as hay lasted, and save the trench for the moment when hay could not carry the herd alone. She would know when that moment arrived. She would know because the cattle would tell her, in their ribs showing sharper, their coats growing dull, their eyes losing the bright attention that meant an animal was getting enough to eat. She would know, and then she would dig. November became December, and the open range began to die. The process was not dramatic at first. Snow came in stages, a dusting, then a crust, then a layer thick enough to hide the grass beneath it. The cattle drifted along the creek bottoms, pawing through snow to reach whatever forage lay below, but the drought-weakened grass was thin, and the snow crust hardened after each freeze-thaw cycle until the surface could bear the weight of a man without breaking. A cow's hoof was not a man's boot. It was wider, softer, and less precise. When the snow crust hardened, the cattle could not paw through it. They stood on top of their own feed and starved. Calla began rationing hay before the crisis fully arrived. She cut each day's allotment by a quarter, feeding 20 pounds per cow instead of 25, and watched her cattle with the close, anxious attention of a woman counting coins. The cowboys from the Broken Spur rode past in early December and saw her feeding in the snow. One of them, a young man with a red scarf and opinions, pulled his horse alongside the corral and called out, "Feeding like January before December comes. Your hay will not see Christmas." Calla did not answer. She measured the next forkful and spread it along the feed rack. "Your trench smells like a brewery and looks like a grave," the cowboy added. "The boys at Spur say you are burying vegetables because you cannot afford to bury your husband proper." Calla finished feeding. She set the fork against the rack and looked at the cowboy with the expression she had developed over 4 months of being told she was wrong, level, still, and absolutely uninterested in his assessment. The cowboy rode on. His laughter carried back on the wind. The hay diminished. Calla marked it on the shed wall alongside the trench progress, a second column of numbers counting down instead of up. By the 15th of December, she had 3.5 tons remaining. By the 20th, 3 tons. The cattle were eating faster than the ration allowed because she could not prevent the stronger cows from shouldering the calves aside and taking more than their share. She built a second feed rack from scrap boards to separate the calves. She moved the weaker animals closer to the shed where she could watch them. She checked hooves, eyes, and coats every morning, looking for the signs that Beaudreau had taught her to read: dull coat, sunken flank, slow movement, the haunted look of an animal whose body was consuming itself. The calves showed it first, not yet dangerous, but visible. The youngest, a heifer born in late April, small and narrow-hipped, stopped gaining weight and began to stand with her head lower than the others, a posture that meant discomfort or despair or both. Boudreau watched the heifer from the shed door. "She will be the first to fail if you wait too long," he said. "I know." "When?" "When the hay cannot carry them alone." Boudreau said nothing. He knew the decision was not his. He had built the trench with her, sealed it with her, tested it with her. But the cattle were hers, and the gamble was hers, and the moment of opening was hers to choose. The crisis arrived on the 27th of December. It did not announce itself with a single event. It accumulated, the way cold accumulates, not all at once, but in layers, each one adding weight to the one beneath it, until the total was more than the structure could bear. The first layer was wind, a northwest wind that began on Christmas Day and did not stop. It drove the temperature down 20 degrees in 6 hours and pushed the snow into drifts that buried fence posts and blocked the path between the house and the shed. Calla fought through the drifts with a shovel and arrived at the corral to find her cattle pressed together in the southeast corner, backs to the wind, heads down, breathing frost. The second layer was ice. Rain fell on the 26th, a brief, cruel rain that lasted 2 hours and then froze. The snow surface became glass. The cattle could not walk without slipping. The calves fell. The old cow Juniper stood in one spot for 14 hours because moving meant risking a broken leg on the ice. The third layer was cold. On the morning of the 27th, Calla stepped outside and felt the air bite her lungs before she had taken 3 steps from the door. The water in the trough had frozen solid overnight, not a skin of ice, but a block. She spent an hour breaking it with a mattock and hauling warm water from the house in buckets. The hay remaining, 2.5 tons. At the current rate of feeding, it would last 18 days. Winter would last at least 3 more months. The math had arrived. Calla walked to the trench. The clay cap was frozen. The surface was white with frost. The sod blocks had bonded to the clay so tightly that the seams had disappeared, and the whole structure looked like nothing more than a long mound of frozen earth, indistinguishable from the landscape around it. She brought the mattock. She brought a shovel. She brought a feed fork and 2 burlap sacks. Boudreau came behind her. He had been sleeping in the shed since November, wrapped in a bedroll and a buffalo robe he had carried in his freight wagon. His ribs had been bruised 2 weeks earlier when the hay sled caught a frozen rut and threw him sideways into the feed rack. He moved carefully, one hand pressed to his left side, his breath short when he bent. "I will open it," Calla said. "I know." He stood beside the trench and watched. His role now was not to teach, but to witness. The first shovels struck the frozen clay and bounced. Calla swung again. A chip flew off. The clay was hard as fired brick. The frost had penetrated deeper than she expected, bonding the cap into a single, rigid mass that resisted the blade like stone. She swung for 10 minutes before the first crack appeared. A line in the clay, running crosswise, 3 feet from the south end. She worked the mattock into the crack and levered. A slab of frozen clay broke free, the size of a dinner plate, 2 inches thick. Beneath it, the sod blocks were frozen but softer. She pried them loose with the shovel. Under the sod, the second layer of clay, the inner seal, was damp instead of frozen. The frost had not penetrated through the full cap. Calla dug through the inner clay with her hands. Her fingers were numb inside her gloves. The material gave way reluctantly, dense and cold, and smelling faintly of something she could not yet identify. Then the seal broke. The smell came first, sharp, sour, immediate, like cider vinegar mixed with something sweeter, something alive and fermented, and entirely unlike the dead, dark smell of rot. Calla leaned back from the opening. Boudreaux stepped forward and knelt. The top 6 inches were black, just as he had predicted, spoiled where the air had lived longest between the cap and the packed material. Dark, slimy, wrong. Calla scooped it out with the fork and threw it aside. Beneath the spoiled layer, the silage was golden orange, fibrous, dense, warm to the touch, not hot, not heated by decay, but warmer than the frozen ground around it, holding the slow warmth of fermentation the way a bread oven holds heat after the fire dies. The color was the color of late autumn straw mixed with pumpkin flesh, and the smell was vinegar and grain and something faintly like beer. Calla pulled a handful free and held it. The material was compressed, slightly sticky, and held its shape when she squeezed it. No air bubbles, no black streaks, no slime except at the very top where the spoilage ended and the good feed began. Boudreaux took a piece, smelled it, tasted it, and spit into the snow. Acid, he said. Good acid. Lactic. That is what kept it. Will they eat it? Put it in the rack. We will know in 5 minutes. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next 5 minutes at the feed rack decide whether every animal Calla owns eats or starves. Calla carried the first forkful of pumpkin straw silage to the feed rack and spread it beside the morning's hay ration. The material steamed faintly in the cold air. Orange gold fibers lay across the rack boards like something pulled from another season, a remnant of autumn dropped into the white, locked world of deep winter. The cattle noticed before Calla stepped back. Not the calves, the old ones. Juniper lifted her head first, nostrils wide, testing the air the way she tested it every time the wind brought a new smell from beyond the corral. She took 2 steps forward, then 3. Juniper lowered her head to the rack and sniffed the silage. She lipped it. She pulled a mouthful free and chewed. Calla held her breath. Juniper chewed for 10 seconds, swallowed, reached for another mouthful. The second cow approached, then a yearling, then the calves pushing between the larger animals to reach the rack. Within 2 minutes, 9 cattle were eating silage. Within 5, the entire herd had gathered at the 2 feed racks, and the sound of chewing, wet, rhythmic, steady, filled the corral like a pulse. Boudreaux stood by the gate and said nothing. Calla stood beside the rack and watched a heifer calf, the small one, the one who had been losing weight, pull silage from the rack with an eagerness that she had not shown toward hay in 2 weeks. The feed was not magic. Calla understood that, and Boudreaux had made certain she understood it. The pumpkin straw silage could not replace hay entirely. It was wet, it was acid, and a cow's rumen needed long fiber roughage to function. But mixed with hay, poor hay, stemmy hay, the gray-green slough hay that the cattle had been picking through with diminishing interest, the silage added energy, moisture, sugar, and palatability. The hay lasted longer because the cattle ate less of it. The silage filled the gap. The 2 feeds together did what neither could do alone. Calla cut a narrow face into the trench, 2 inches deep across the full 6-foot width, and covered the exposed surface with wet burlap sacks weighted by boards. 2 inches per day. No more. The air was the enemy. The discipline was the seal. Each morning she checked the burlap. Each morning the silage beneath it was golden, acid, and firm. The spoiled layer at the top was gone now, a one-time loss, sacrificed to the air that had lived in the cap before fermentation pushed it out. The trench was holding. The world beyond the Willow Knife place was not holding. On the 3rd of January, a blizzard moved across the upper Niobrara country with the steady, implacable force of something that intended to stay. The wind came first, horizontal, needled with ice crystals that cut exposed skin and blinded any animal or person facing northwest. Then the snow, not falling but driven, packing into every gap, every crack, every opening that the wind could find. The temperature dropped below 0 on the 4th, below 10 below on the 5th. On the 6th of January, the thermometer on McVeigh's store porch, the only calibrated instrument in the district, read 22 degrees below 0, and the mercury had stopped moving because the store's door had frozen shut and no one could get close enough to read it accurately. The broken spur lost cattle first. Their open-range herd, 4,000 strong at autumn gather, had drifted south and east ahead of the wind, following the instinct that told them to move away from cold and toward shelter. But there was no shelter. The creek bottoms filled with snow. The draws became traps. Cattle walked in, packed together for warmth, and could not walk out because the snow behind them drifted shut. Vale's men found the first dead cattle on the 7th of January. 18 head in a draw 3 miles east of the Niobrara crossing, pressed against a fence line they could not cross, frozen standing up. The cowboys pried them apart with axes to count them. By the 10th, the broken spur had lost over 200 confirmed dead. The actual number was higher. They could not reach the herds that had drifted beyond the river, but 200 was enough to turn Vale's face into something Calla had never seen on it before. Not anger, not grief, but the blankness of a man watching something he had spent his life building come apart in conditions he could not control. Cress lost cattle too, not his own. Cress did not own cattle, he traded them, but a shipment of 60 head he had purchased cheap from a rancher near Gordon, intending to hold them on rented grass and resell in spring. The rented grass was buried under 3 feet of crusted snow. The 60 head drifted into a dry creek bed and starved. Cress stood at McVeigh's store and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Someone will pay for this." He did not specify who. Miriam Pike's milk cow weakened in the 2nd week of January. The cow was a brindle shorthorn, 9 years old, the source of the Pike family's butter, cream, and cheese. She stopped eating on the 9th. She stood in the Pike barn with her head down and her ribs showing through a coat that should have been thick with winter fat. Miriam came to the Willow Knife place on the 11th. She did not knock. She stood at the corral gate and looked at Calla's cattle, thin but standing, coats rough but not staring, eating silage and hay from the 2 feed racks while the wind pushed snow across the yard. "Teach me what to feed her," Miriam said. Her voice was flat with the effort of asking for something she had once dismissed. Calla sent 2 forkfuls of silage home with Miriam, wrapped in burlap and tied on a sled. She told her to mix it with whatever hay she had, feed small amounts at first, because a cow unused to silage could scour if the acid hit an empty rumen too hard, and to keep the cow in the barn where the wind could not steal the calories the feed provided. Miriam took the silage and said nothing. She pulled the sled home through the drifts. Her footprints filled in behind her within the hour. On the 14th of January, Ephraim Vale came to Calla's door. He did not come on horseback. His horse had gone lame on the ice 2 days earlier, and he had walked 4 miles from the Broken Spur line camp through drifts that reached his thighs. His coat was white. His eyebrows were frosted. His hands, when he pulled off his gloves in Calla's kitchen, were the color of raw beef, red and swollen and cracked at every knuckle. Calla gave him coffee. She did not ask why he had come. She waited. Vale held the cup in both hands and drank without tasting it. His eyes moved around the kitchen, the stove, the table, the clipping on the wall, the carpenter's pencil marks beside the door, and settled on the window through which he could see the corral and the cattle standing in the lee of the shed, chewing. "How many have you lost?" he said. "One calf. Born late, never strong, died in the first blizzard." "One. One." Vale drank. The silence filled the kitchen like heat from the stove, dense, physical, impossible to ignore. "I called it garbage," he said. "You called it a dead herd." "I was wrong about the herd." He set the cup down. "I was not wrong about the hay. 8 tons would not have saved them, but you did not save them with hay." "No. You saved them with pumpkins." "Pumpkins, straw, millet, chaff, corn stalks, and clay. And a Frenchman who knew what I did not." Vale looked at her. The blankness was still there. The losses had not yet finished arriving, and he carried them on his face the way a man carries a load he knows will not get lighter, but beneath it, something else. Not admiration, recognition. The acknowledgement from one cattleman to another that the person across the table understood something essential about keeping animals alive. "I have lost more than 300 head that I know of," Vale said. "There are more I cannot reach. The draws are full of them. We will not know the real count until spring. 300 out of 4,000, and the winter was not over." "Mrs. Whitcomb," Vale said, "I would like to see the trench." She took him outside. The wind was down for the first time in 3 days, and the air hung still and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that turned breath into crystals that fell straight down instead of drifting. The trench lay under its cap of clay and sod and snow, a long white ridge that looked no different from the surrounding ground. Calla pulled back the burlap from the cut face. The golden-orange silage lay exposed for a moment, bright against the white world, warm-smelling, alive in a landscape where almost everything was dead or dormant. Vale looked at it. He reached out and took a handful. He squeezed it. He smelled it. He did not taste it, but he held it close to his face for a long time, as if trying to reconcile the thing in his hand with the ruined pumpkins he had dismissed 3 months earlier. "I have been riding cattle for 30 years, he said. "I have never seen feed come out of the ground in January." He put the silage back. He looked at the cattle. He looked at Calla. "How much is left?" he said. "Enough if I am careful. 35 days of silage, maybe 40 if I cut the face thinner." "And the hay?" 12 days, maybe 15 with the silage stretching it." "That is close." "Everything this winter is close." Vale pulled his gloves on. He looked at the trench one more time. He said, "I called it garbage. It is feed." Then he walked back into the snow, 4 miles to the Broken Spur line camp, carrying in his mind the image of 37 cattle eating pumpkin silage in the middle of the worst winter the northern plains had ever seen. Behind him, Calla covered the face with burlap and boards. The air was the enemy. The discipline was the seal. The trench held. But the winter was not finished. The 3rd week of January brought the worst of it. A storm system that rolled across the Dakotas and down into Nebraska with a violence that witnesses would describe for decades, not as a blizzard, but as a siege, a continuous, battering assault of wind and snow and cold that lasted 4 days and killed cattle, horses, and men across 1,000 miles of open country. On the 18th of January, the temperature at the Willow Knife place dropped below 25 below zero. Calla could not read the thermometer exactly because the glass was frosted over, but the mercury was at the bottom of the scale and the water in the house froze in the pitcher beside her bed. She could not reach the trench for 2 days. The drifts between the house and the shed were higher than her head. She dug a path with a shovel, working blind in a world of white wind, and it filled behind her before she reached the corral. The cattle huddled in the shed. All 37 of them, Juniper at the center, the calves pressed against their mothers, the steers and bulls forming a wall on the windward side. They had eaten the last of the hay in the rack the previous evening. The rack was empty. Calla fought through the drifts to the trench. The clay cap was buried under 2 feet of new snow. She shoveled the snow away, found the burlap, pulled it back, and cut the face. 2 inches. The silage was cold, colder than it had been in December, but intact, golden, acid. The smell rose into the frozen air and disappeared. She loaded the fork. She carried it to the shed. She spread it in the rack. The cattle ate. She went back. She cut another 2 inches. She carried it. They ate. For 2 days, she made the trip 9 times each day, trench to shed, shed to trench, carrying silage on a fork through drifts that shifted and reformed between trips. Her hands bled inside her gloves. Her lungs burned from the cold. She fell twice in the drifts and lay for long seconds with her face in the snow, feeling the cold press against her like a hand before she pushed herself up and kept walking. Boudreau could not help. His bruised ribs had worsened to something that might have been cracked. He could not lift his arms above his chest without stopping to breathe through the pain. He sat in the shed and watched the cattle eat and said, when Calla brought him coffee on the afternoon of the 19th, "You are feeding them with your body." "I'm feeding them with pumpkins," she said. "My body is just the delivery." "Your body will not last if you do not eat." She had not eaten since the morning of the 18th. There was food in the house, salt pork, beans, hard biscuits. But the time required to cook and eat was time the cattle did not have. She ate a biscuit standing beside the feed rack, watching the heifer calf pull silage from the boards, and felt the biscuit sit in her stomach like a stone. The storm broke on the 21st. The wind died. The sky cleared. The sun came out, pale and distant, and the snow sparkled in every direction like a field of crushed glass. Calla stood in the corral and counted. 37 head, all standing. The one calf had died weeks ago. The old cow she had butchered for meat in early December, when it became clear the animal was too weak to survive and too valuable as protein to waste. That was the second loss. 36 animals remained. They were thin. Ribs showed on every cow. The calves looked narrow and brittle, like animals made of sticks and hide. The steers had lost the weight they had been gaining for spring sale, and the bulls stood with the gaunt patience of creatures that had spent everything they had just to remain upright. But they were alive. Across the district, the count was different. Broken Spur would eventually report losing more than half its range herd. Some estimates would run higher. Smaller outfits lost everything. A rancher named Torrey, 12 miles west, lost all 68 head and was found walking toward Valentine in his stocking feet because he had given his boots to his son. A settler family near the Snake River bottoms lost their oxen, their milk cow, and their draft team, and would have lost their children if a neighbor had not broken through the drifts with a sled of firewood on the 5th day. The winter of 1886 to 1887 would become known as the Great Die-Up. It would end the open range era. It would transform how cattle were raised, fed, and sheltered across the northern plains, and it would begin a slow, reluctant shift toward exactly what Calla Whitcomb had built in a trench on a clay rise behind a roofed shed on 160 deeded acres, the principle that winter feed must be stored, not gambled on. But that was later. That was history seen from a distance. On the 21st of January, 1887, Calla Whitcomb stood in a corral in the upper Niobrara country and looked at 36 cattle that should have been dead and were not. Then she walked to the trench. She pulled back the burlap. She cut 2 inches. She carried the feed to the rack. The air was the enemy. The discipline was the seal. She kept cutting. The aftermath of the January storm was not relief. It was accounting. Calla spent the 22nd and 23rd clearing snow from the trench cap, repairing a section of corral fence that the wind had twisted loose, and hauling water from the well, which had frozen to a depth of 4 feet and required an hour of work with a heated iron bar before it yielded anything drinkable. Boudreau sat in the shed with his ribs wrapped in strips of flour sacking and directed the cattle into feeding order, weaker animals first, stronger animals second, because the hierarchy of hunger had reversed itself during the storm, and the bulls were now shouldering calves away from the rack with a desperation they had not shown before. The trench had lost approximately 8 days of feed to the spoiled top layer and the corner the boys had cut in November. Calla recalculated. She had roughly 27 days of silage remaining at the 2-inch cutting rate. Hay was down to 9 days, maybe 11 if she thinned the ration further. The calendar said January 23rd. Grass would not return until late April at the earliest. She was still short, but the gap had narrowed from impossible to merely brutal. She cut the face thinner, 1.5 inches instead of 2 inches. The cattle ate less silage per day, but she stretched the hay further by mixing the 2 feeds in the rack, a layer of stemmy slough hay covered with a forkful of silage, so that the cattle ate the hay they would otherwise have ignored because it came with the taste and smell of something better. Boudreau had taught her this. He called it seasoning, the way a cook seasons food to make poor ingredients palatable. The pumpkin silage was the seasoning, the hay was the meal. It worked. Not perfectly, the weakest calf still ate slowly, and 2 of the yearling heifers had developed a loose stool that worried Calla until Boudreau told her it was the acid adjusting their rumens and would pass in 3 days. It passed in 4. Miriam Pike's milk cow survived. Miriam arrived at the Willow Knife place on the 26th of January, pulling an empty sled. She did not bring the sled because she expected more silage. She brought it because she had something to say and needed a reason to make the trip that her husband would not question. She stood at the corral gate and watched Calla feed the morning ration. The cattle moved to the rack in the order Boudreau had established, calves and weak animals first, bulls and steers after, and ate with the steady mechanical rhythm of animals that had learned to trust the schedule. "She's standing," Miriam said. She meant the milk cow. "Standing is good." "Standing and eating. She ate the silage first, then the hay. This morning she chewed cud." Miriam paused. The word cud carried more weight than a non-farmer would understand. A cow that chews cud is a cow whose rumen is working. A cow whose rumen is working is a cow that is digesting feed. A cow that is digesting feed is a cow that will live. "It smells like a cellar crock," Miriam said. "Exactly like a cellar crock." Calla looked at her. 3 months earlier, Miriam had stood on the road and said, "A crock of cabbage is not 38 cows." She had been right. A crock was not 38 cows. But the principle inside the crock, the principle that air is the enemy, that pressure and time turn sugar into acid, that acid preserves what air destroys, that principle scaled. "It is a cellar crock," Calla said, 60 feet long. Miriam did not smile. Smiling was not something farm women in the upper Niobrara did casually in January, but her face changed, a loosening around the jaw, a softening in the eyes, and she said, "Erwin wants to know how you did it. Tell him to come and I will show him. He will not come. He does not believe a woman invented cattle feed. I did not invent it. A Frenchman in Illinois tried it with corn. A Frenchman in my shed tried it with pumpkins. I dug the trench." Miriam pulled the sled around and started home. After 20 yards, she stopped and turned back. "I brought you 3 wagon loads of straw, and I said if it turned bad, I never came. It did not turn bad. I came." She walked into the snow. Calla watched her until she disappeared over the rise, a dark figure against the white, pulling an empty sled home to a cow that was chewing cud because a widow's theory about cellar crocks had turned out to be right. The validation came in stages, and each stage carried its own tension because validation invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited the one man who had the most to lose from Calla's success. The first stage was private. Calla knew the silage worked because her cattle were alive and eating. The evidence was in the corral every morning, 36 head standing, chewing, producing the dense, steamy manure that meant feed was being digested and energy was being used. The weakest calf gained a pound, then 2. The yearling heifer's stools firmed. Juniper's coat, which had dulled in December, began to carry the faint sheen that meant an animal was maintaining condition instead of spending it. The second stage was Miriam. Her confirmation mattered because Miriam was practical, skeptical, and married to a man who represented the community's default position, that Calla was a widow with a theory, not a rancher with a method. The third stage was Vale, and it carried the most weight because Vale was the authority. He came back on the 2nd of February. Not on foot this time, the snow had settled enough for horseback, though the drifts along the river road were still chest-high in places, and the trail was a narrow trench cut by traffic between McVeigh's store and the Broken Spur headquarters. Vale brought 2 of his cowboys. He did not announce the visit or ask permission. He rode to the corral, dismounted, tied his horse, and stood at the fence for 15 minutes watching Calla's cattle eat. Calla let him watch. She had learned that the most powerful thing she could do with skeptics was nothing. Let the cattle speak. Let the feed speak. Let the silence fill with evidence that required no defense. Vale walked the corral. He looked at each animal the way he had looked at the haystack in October, diagnostically, without sentiment. He checked teeth on 2 of the yearlings by pressing their lips open with his thumb. He ran his hand along the ribs of a steer and counted the spaces between them. He lifted a calf's tail and examined the stool on the ground beneath it. Then he walked to the trench. The cut face was exposed. Calla had just finished the morning's feeding, and the golden-orange silage lay open in the cold air, steaming faintly, smelling of vinegar and fermented grain. Vale knelt beside it. He pulled off one glove and pressed his bare hand into the face. "Dense," he said. "Boudreaux packed it with horses." "The Frenchman?" "Yes." "Where is he?" "In the shed. His ribs are still healing." Vale stood. He looked at the trench, the clay cap, the sod blocks, the boards and stones, the burlap covering the cut face, and Calla could see him assembling the method in his mind the way a cattleman assembles a picture of a herd from its tracks. The digging, the layering, the packing, the sealing, the cutting, the discipline of 2 inches per day. "How much did you lose from the top?" he said. 6 inches. 30 pounds, maybe more." "And the corner?" "The corner was sabotage. Boys from Ash Hollow Crossing." Vale said nothing about the boys. He looked at his 2 cowboys, who were standing at the fence staring at the trench with the expressions of men encountering something that contradicted a belief they had held without questioning it. "I called it garbage," Vale said. I called it a dead herd. I was wrong about both. He did not say it warmly. He did not say it with admiration or wonder or any of the emotions that a story about conversion is supposed to contain. He said it the way he said everything, flatly, precisely, as a man correcting an entry in a ledger that he had written incorrectly and could no longer justify. "How many have you lost?" Calla asked. "More than I will count until the snow melts. Hundreds, maybe more." He pulled his glove back on. "Mrs. Whitcomb, I have ridden cattle for 30 years, and I have never lost a winter like this one. The open range is finished. The men who think it is not finished are the men who will lose everything next time. There will be a next time. There is always a next time. The question is whether you have feet in the ground or faith in the grass." He mounted his horse. He told his cowboys to remember what they had seen. Then he rode north, and within a week, the story of the Whitcomb Trench had reached every ranch and homestead within 30 miles of the Niobrara crossing. The story traveled faster than Calla could control it, and like all stories that travel fast, it changed shape along the way. At McVeigh's store, the version was charitable but vague. The Whitcomb widow had dug a pit and filled it with something that kept her cattle alive. Details varied. Some said it was pickled hay. Some said it was corn mash. One man said she had buried an entire field of cabbages and fed them frozen to the cows, which was wrong in every particular, but captured the general principle. At the Broken Spur, the version was professional and grudging. Vale's men acknowledged that the trench had worked, but debated whether it could scale to a herd of 4,000. The answer was no, not in the form Calla had built it, but the principle of stored winter feed had taken root in Vale's mind, and he would spend the next 2 years experimenting with hay storage, covered stacks, and eventually a timber-lined pit silo that owed its existence to a 60-foot trench full of ruined pumpkins. And at Cress's table, wherever that table was, the version was dangerous. Royal P. Cress had lost 60 head of cattle he had planned to resell at profit. He had lost the leverage he held over Calla's banknote because a woman who brings 36 cattle through the worst winter in memory is not a woman the bank forecloses on without political cost. And he had lost something harder to replace than money, the certainty that he understood how the Niobrara country worked. Cress's response was not surrender. It was adaptation. He arrived at McVeigh's store on the 10th of February, wearing the same Omaha coat and carrying a new story. The story went like this. Silage was untested. Silage might taint beef, making it unsellable to Eastern buyers. Silage might cause cows to abort their calves, destroying a herd's future even as it preserved its present. Silage was, at best, an experiment, and at worst, a poison that a desperate widow was feeding to cattle she would eventually try to sell to honest men. The claims were not invented from nothing. Real concerns about silage had circulated among conservative farmers for years. Questions about milk taste, meat quality, and reproductive effects that the agricultural press had debated without settling. Cress did not need the claims to be true. He needed them to be plausible enough to make buyers hesitate, and hesitation was all he required. If Calla's spring cattle carried the reputation of tainted feed, their sale price would drop. If the price dropped far enough, she could not meet the banknote. If she could not meet the note, Cress could buy the herd and the land at the price he had wanted all along. The gossip reached Calla through Miriam, who heard it from Irwin, who heard it at McVeigh's. Miriam repeated it at the corral gate with the flat precision of someone delivering bad news they wish they did not have to deliver. "He says the silage will make the calves come wrong," Miriam said. "The calves are fine. He says the beef will taste sour, and no buyer in Valentine will touch it." "The beef is months away from sale. No one has tasted it." "He does not need proof, Calla. He needs doubt. Doubt is cheaper than proof, and it works faster." Calla stood at the feed rack with a fork in her hand, and the taste of iron in her mouth. Miriam was right. Cress did not need to prove the silage was dangerous. He only needed enough people to wonder, and wondering was free. "What do I do?" Calla said. "You feed the cattle. You bring them to spring. You let the beef speak for itself." Miriam paused. "And you find a buyer who trusts what he sees more than what he hears." February was endurance. The worst of the cold had passed, but winter in the Niobrara country did not end. It loosened, then tightened again, then loosened, in a cycle that wore down animals and people alike. Snow melted during the day and froze at night. The cattle walked on ice every morning and mud every afternoon. The hay ran out on the 17th of February, and for the remaining weeks of winter, the herd ate silage alone, mixed with straw, with dried creek grass, with anything Calla could find that provided fiber to supplement the acid richness of the fermented pumpkin. The silage held. The face retreated inch by inch down the length of the trench, golden orange giving way to the packed straw of the drainage layer at the bottom. By early March, the trench was 3/4 empty. By mid-March, it was gone. But the grass was coming. Not green yet, brown and matted and weak from the winter's weight, but present beneath the thinning snow, reachable by hooves that no longer had to fight through crust. The cattle spread out from the corral for the first time since December. They grazed. They moved with the slow, purposeful rhythm of animals rebuilding the habit of finding their own feed. Calla watched them from the bluff above the creek and felt the tension in her body begin to release, not all at once, but in stages, the way a fist unclenches finger by finger. 36 head. Alive. Thin, but alive. The banknote was still due. Cress was still circling. The steers needed weight before they could sell. But the herd had survived, and survival was the foundation on which everything else could be built. Boudreau sat on a stump beside the shed and watched the cattle graze. His ribs had healed enough for him to walk without pressing his hand to his side, but he moved carefully, the way old injuries teach a body to move, slower, more deliberate, with an awareness of fragility that had not been there before. "You are short on hay for next year," he said. "I know. And you have no pumpkins." "I know." "What will you fill the trench with?" Calla looked at the empty trench. 60 feet of clay walls, scraped clean, the bottom layer of willow brush and straw dark with moisture. It looked like an open grave, the same thing the cowboys had called it in October, and the comparison was just as wrong now as it had been then. "Green rye," she said. "Weeds, whatever grows first. And I will plant pumpkins. Not scavenge them, plant them." "A rancher who plants pumpkins." "A rancher who feeds cattle through winter." Boudreau smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and the expression changed his face so completely that he looked like a different man, younger, lighter, as if the smile had been stored somewhere deep and brought out only when the evidence justified it. "The Elgin man would have liked you," he said. "The Elgin man's trench failed. Half of it failed. You built on the half that worked. That is what knowledge does when the right person holds it." The bank agent arrived on the 22nd of March. Not Cress, the actual bank agent, a clerk from Valentine named Oster, who rode a mule and carried a leather case of documents. He had come to assess the Willow Knife place and determine whether the note could be restructured or whether foreclosure proceedings should begin. Oster was not a cattleman. He was a young man in a town coat who had been sent to count assets and report numbers. He stood at the corral fence and counted 36 head. He walked the hay racks, the shed, the house, the well, and the empty trench. He wrote figures in a notebook with a pencil that he kept sharpening because the lead kept breaking in the cold. "Mr. Cress has recommended foreclosure," Oster said, reading from a letter. He states that the operation is unsustainable and the herd has been fed experimental feed of questionable quality. The herd is standing in front of you, Calla said. Oster looked at the cattle. He looked at his notebook. He looked at Calla. I will report what I see, he said. I see 36 live cattle and a property in working condition. I will also report that Mr. Kress has an interest in acquiring the property, which the bank may wish to consider when evaluating his recommendation. It was the most help a bank clerk had ever given Calla, and he gave it without inflection, as if noting a conflict of interest were simply part of the arithmetic. The note was restructured. The March payment was deferred to June. Calla had 3 months to sell steers and raise cash. It was not generosity. It was the bank's recognition that a functioning ranch with live cattle was worth more than a foreclosed property with none. Kress received the news at McVeigh's store and said nothing that witnesses recalled. But his face, according to Irwin Pike, who happened to be buying flour at the time, went the color of tallow, which is the color a man's face goes. When a plan he has been building for 6 months falls apart in a sentence delivered by a mule-riding clerk. Spring changed the nature of the work, but not its urgency. The cattle needed weight. The grass was slow to return, a consequence of the drought the previous summer and the crushing winter that had compacted the soil and killed root systems across miles of range. Calla grazed her herd on the creek bottoms where moisture lingered, rotating them between 3 sections of her deeded land to prevent overgrazing. Boudreau helped with the rotation, riding one of the saddle horses despite his ribs, because the work of moving cattle was the kind of work his body remembered even when it hurt. He and Calla argued about the grazing plan. He wanted longer rotations. She wanted shorter ones. And the argument was the kind that only happens between people who respect each other enough to disagree without damage. You are over-resting the south section, Boudreau said. The grass there is 3 weeks ahead of the north. Move the cattle south. If I move them south too early, I strip the new growth before it establishes. If you keep them north too long, they lose weight they need for sale. I will move them in 4 days. Move them in 2. She moved them in 3 because compromise was the language of partnership and because Boudreau was half right, which was as right as anyone could be about grass that had survived the worst winter in memory. The secondary crisis arrived in April, and it came not from the sky but from the road. A settler family named Doan, a man, his wife, and 3 children under the age of 7, had wintered 12 miles northwest of the Willowknife place on a quarter section they had filed the previous spring. They had arrived in Nebraska with 2 oxen, a milk cow, a draft horse, and the conviction that the grass would carry their animals through winter the same way it carried wild game. The grass did not carry them. The oxen survived because the Doans fed them cottonwood bark and dried brush when the snow buried the range. The milk cow survived because Mrs. Doan rationed hay so carefully that the cow ate less than 10 pounds a day for 3 months and emerged in spring as a skeleton wrapped in hide. The draft horse died in January, but the crisis was not the horse. The crisis was the children. The Doan children had been eating corn mush, dried beans, and whatever small game their father could trap since November. By April, the youngest, a girl of 2, had developed the swollen gums and loose teeth that meant scurvy, and the other 2 were showing the listlessness that meant their bodies were running on reserves that had almost run out. Word reached Calla through a rider who stopped to water his horse at her well. The Doans were in trouble. The children were sick. The nearest doctor was in Valentine, 40 miles away, and the road was still half blocked by snowmelt and mud. Calla loaded a sled with food, dried beef, beans, a sack of potatoes she had been saving, and 4 forkfuls of the last remaining silage from the far end of the trench, which she had been holding as emergency feed for the calves. She hitched the saddle horse and drove 12 miles over a road that was part mud, part ice, and part standing water from the spring melt. The sled broke through creek ice 2 miles from the Doan place. The left runner dropped into water up to the horse's belly, and the sled tipped sideways, spilling half the load into the creek. Calla unhitched the horse, hauled the remaining supplies to dry ground, repacked them on the sled, and dragged the sled by hand for a quarter-mile until the runner caught solid ground. She arrived at the Doan cabin at dusk. The cabin was 12 by 14 feet, built of sod and cottonwood poles, with a single window made of oiled paper that let in a light the color of old butter. The inside smelled of smoke, unwashed children, and the flat mineral smell of people who had been eating too little for too long. Calla gave them the food. She told Mrs. Doan to boil the potatoes and feed the children the water as well as the flesh, because the water carried what the children's bodies were missing. She told Mr. Doan that his milk cow needed better feed, or she would not calve, and that silage made from any green material, rye, weeds, clover, even grass clippings packed and sealed in a trench, would carry an animal through conditions that open grazing could not. She showed him the silage she had brought. She explained the layers: wet material, wet, dry, packed with weight, sealed with clay. She explained the cutting, 2 inches, no more, the face covered when not in use. She explained the principle: air is the enemy. Pressure and time and sugar make acid, acid preserves. Don't listen the way men listen when they have just come through something that nearly killed their children, with absolute attention and no pride left to interfere with learning. "Where do I get pumpkins?" he said. "You do not need pumpkins, you need sugar. Green rye has sugar. Young corn has sugar. Even weeds have sugar if you cut them before they dry." Calla paused. "Pumpkins were what I had. You use what you have." She drove back to the Willow Knife place in the dark, guiding the horse by feel along a road she could barely see, the empty sled rattling behind her over frozen ruts. She arrived after midnight. Boudreaux was asleep in the shed. The cattle were shapes in the corral, dark against dark, breathing steam. She put the horse away, hung the harness, and stood for a moment beside the empty trench. It had been full in December. It had fed 36 cattle through the worst winter in the history of the northern plains. Now it was clay walls and a memory of vinegar, and somewhere 12 miles away, a man was listening to his sick daughter breathe and thinking about trenches and green rye and the principle that a widow had carried to his door on a broken sled. Calla went inside. She ate cold beans from the pot. She slept. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is often built months before anyone sees the danger. Boudreaux died on the 16th of August, 1887. The cause was pneumonia, made worse by the rib injury that had never fully healed. He had coughed through the spring, a wet, rattling cough that he dismissed as dust and age, and the accumulated effect of 30 years of sleeping in freight wagons. By June, the cough had deepened. By July, he was spitting blood into a rag that he kept folded in his shirt pocket, and Calla could hear him breathing from across the yard, a sound like air being drawn through wet paper. She wanted him to see a doctor. He refused. He said doctors were for men who intended to recover, and he had known since the rib injury that the winter had broken something inside him that spring would not repair. He continued to work, not the heavy labor. His body could no longer manage shovels, scrapers, or horses, but the careful work of planning and teaching that had always been his real contribution. He sat on the stump beside the shed and watched Calla plant pumpkins in the creek bottom, 300 hills, each one seeded and mounded by hand, and told her she was spacing them too close. "The vines need room," he said. "If they crowd, the fruit stays small and the sugar stays low." I need volume, not size. You need sugar. Sugar is what feeds the ferment. 100 large pumpkins with high sugar will make better silage than 300 small ones with none. She thinned the hills to 200. He was right. She knew he was right because he was always right about the things that mattered, the technical things, the material things, the things that could be tested and measured and confirmed. His knowledge was not instinct. It was the accumulated result of watching, failing, watching again, and remembering. In his last weeks, Boudreau told Calla things she had not asked about. Not about silage, about himself. He had left Trois-Rivières at 19 because his father's farm could not support 6 sons. He had worked dairy in Wisconsin, grain in Illinois, freight in Nebraska, and dozens of odd jobs in between: farrier, fence builder, wool sorter, ice cutter. He had never married. He had never owned land. He had lived the life of a man who moved through the world doing necessary work for other people, and the only thing he had kept from all those years was knowledge. Knowledge is the only cargo that does not weigh the wagon, he said. This was on the 14th of August, 2 days before the end. He was sitting on the stump, wrapped in a blanket despite the August heat, his face the color of old parchment. "You sound like a preacher," Calla said. "A preacher would tell you to pray. I'm telling you to pack the trench tighter." She laughed. It was the last time she laughed in his presence. He died in the shed, on the bedroll he had slept on since November. Calla found him in the morning, still, cool, his hands folded on his chest as if he had arranged them himself before the breathing stopped. The rag from his shirt pocket was on the ground beside him, spotted with blood that had dried to the color of rust. She buried him on the bluff beside Nathan, in clay soil that she dug herself. She did not hold a service because there was no one to hold it for. Boudreau had no family that she knew of, no friends besides herself, no community that would miss him. She marked the grave with a piece of limestone and carved his name with a chisel, Matthias Boudreau, and beneath it the dates she thought were right, and beneath that nothing, because the things he had taught her could not be carved in stone and did not need to be. There are moments in a life when grief and gratitude occupy the same space, and neither one crowds the other out. Calla stood beside the grave on the bluff and looked at the Niobrara bottoms, the creek running low and clear, the grass green and full in a way it had not been the previous summer, the pumpkin vine spreading through the creek bottom soil in dark green tangles, and felt both things at once, fully, without resolution. She went back to work. The first public teaching happened in September, and it was Miriam who organized it. Miriam had spent the summer experimenting with her own small trench, 8 feet long, 3 feet wide, shallow, filled with garden waste, pumpkin scraps, clover, and straw. The trench produced enough silage to feed her milk cow for 3 weeks, which was 3 weeks more than she had expected, and 3 weeks that changed her understanding of what a farm wife's work could include. She told 6 women at the Ash Hollow Crossing quilting circle. 3 of them told their husbands. 2 of the husbands came to Calla. The teaching day happened at the Willow Knife Place on the 14th of September. 11 people came, 7 men, 4 women, including Miriam. They brought notebooks, sacks for samples, and the careful, skeptical attention of people who had watched their neighbors' cattle die and were not willing to let it happen again. Calla showed them the trench. She explained the layers. She demonstrated packing with a maul. Boudreau's horses had been replaced by a heavy timber head on a hickory handle that Calla swung into the packed material with the rhythm of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She explained the principle simply, the way Boudreau had explained it to her: wet and dry together, packed without air, sealed with clay. The sugar ferments. The acid preserves. The air is the enemy. A man named Rudd asked how deep the trench needed to be. Calla said it depended on how many animals and how long the winter. She gave him the arithmetic. A cow eats roughly 25 to 30 pounds of roughage per day. Silage is heavier than hay because of moisture. Figure 40 pounds of silage per cow per day mixed with whatever hay you have. Work backward from there. Rudd wrote the numbers in a notebook. His pencil moved slowly, deliberately, the way a man writes when he's writing something he intends to use. A woman named Aldous asked whether the silage could be fed to chickens. Calla said she did not know. She said the principle was about preservation, not nutrition, and that different animals needed different feeds. She told Aldous to try a small amount and watch the birds. A teenager stood at the back of the group, a girl of 15 or 16, tall, narrow-shouldered, with the sun-darkened face of someone who spent her days outdoors. She did not take notes. She watched Calla's hands. After the others left, the girl stayed. She walked to the trench and looked at the clay walls. She picked up the maul and swung it into the ground, not with Calla's rhythm, but with the natural force of someone whose body understood physical work. "My name is Nell Dacey," the girl said. "My father's cattle died in January. All of them. 41 head. Calla said nothing. There was nothing to say to that number. "I want to learn this," Nell said. "Not from a book. From you." Calla looked at the girl's hands, cracked and calloused, the hands of someone who had already spent years doing work that most people twice her age avoided. She looked at the girl's eyes, which were steady and unafraid, and asking for something that was not charity. "Come back tomorrow," Calla said. "Bring a shovel." Nell came back. She brought a shovel and a willingness to work that reminded Calla of Boudreaux, not the knowledge, which would take years, but the quality beneath the knowledge, the stubbornness to learn a thing by doing it wrong and doing it again until the material stopped resisting. Nell learned to pack corners. She learned to judge moisture by squeeze. Too wet dripped, too dry crumbled, right held its shape like bread dough. She learned to cut the face in straight lines, to cover it with burlap, to smell for the sharp vinegar that meant life and the thick sweetness that meant death. She became, over the next 2 years, the person Calla trusted most with the work that Boudreaux had begun. But Cress was not finished. The restructured banknote had bought Calla time, not safety. The June payment came due, and she met it barely by selling 4 steers to a buyer in Valentine who had not heard Cress's rumors about tainted beef. The price was low but honest, $11 a head for cattle that weighed less than they should have after a winter of survival rations. $44. The note required $37. She had $7 remaining and a herd of 32, the 4 steers sold, and the numbers adjusting to the reality that survival did not mean prosperity. Cress shifted tactics. He stopped spreading rumors about the silage. He started spreading a different story, that Calla was profitable enough to buy out. He approached the bank with an offer to purchase the Willow Knife note at a premium, which would give the bank immediate cash and give Cress the right to set the terms of Calla's repayment. The offer was legal, it was common, and it was the most dangerous thing Cress had done because a note holder controlled the debtor's calendar, and Cress's calendar had only one date on it, the date Calla could not pay. Calla learned about the offer from Oster, the bank clerk, who rode out on his mule a second time, not as an official visit, but as what he called a courtesy, which was a word bank clerks used when they were doing something their employers might not approve of. "Mister, Cress has offered to buy your note," Oster said. "The bank has not decided. I thought you should know. Can I prevent it? You can pay the note in full. That is the only prevention." The note balance was $112. Calla had 7. She stood at the corral fence and felt the arithmetic close around her again. The same arithmetic that had defined her life since Nathan died. The arithmetic of too little against too much, of margins so thin they cut. How long before the bank decides? She asked. 60 days, perhaps 90. 60 days. She had 60 days to find $105 or lose the Willow Knife place to a man who had been circling it since July. The new trench, the second trench, dug closer to the corral, filled with green rye, clover, pumpkin, and straw, was 3/4 full and sealed. The pumpkin crop from the creek bottom had yielded 160 usable fruits, smaller than the frost-killed scavenge of the previous year, but deliberately grown and harvested at the right moment. Nell had helped pack it. Miriam had contributed straw. The trench would feed the cattle. The cattle would survive another winter. But survival required land, and land required money, and money required something Calla had not yet figured out. She needed the cattle to gain weight. She needed the steers to sell at a price that reflected health, not desperation. She needed buyers who trusted what they saw. She needed the beef to speak for itself. The steers gained weight through September on a combination of late grass and silage from the second trench. Calla fed them differently than she fed the breeding stock: heavier rations, richer mix, more pumpkin, and less straw, because the steers needed to carry flesh by October, and flesh was the only currency that would keep Royal Cress from owning her land. She watched them the way a gambler watches cards. Every pound mattered. Every rib that disappeared beneath a thickening layer of muscle and fat was $1 she might collect at sale. She ran her hands along their flanks each morning, pressing her thumbs into the loin to gauge the depth of cover, and marked the progress on the shed wall in a third column beside the trench tallies and the hay count. A column she labeled simply weight, though what she meant was time. Nell Dacey came to the Willow Knife place 4 days a week. She hauled, packed, cut, and cleaned without complaint and without pay, because her father's ranch had nothing to pay with, and because the knowledge she was accumulating was worth more than wages to a girl who had watched 41 cattle die and intended never to watch it again. Nell learned fast, not the way Boudreaux had learned through decades of observation and travel, but the way young people learn when the lesson has been written in loss, urgently, completely, with a memory that holds because the cost of forgetting is visible in the empty corral at home. By early October, the 8 steers Calla had reserved for sale were the best conditioned cattle on the Willow Knife place. Not fat, that would have required grain she did not have, but solid, smooth-coated, moving with the easy stride of animals whose bodies were not spending more than they received. Their ribs were covered. Their eyes were bright. Their coats had the sheen that cattlemen read the way sailors read the surface of water, as a sign of what lay beneath. Calla needed a buyer. The obvious market was Valentine, 40 miles east. But Valentine was Cress's territory. He knew every buyer, every broker, every man who purchased cattle for the eastern packing houses. If Calla brought her steers to Valentine, Cress would be waiting not to bid, but to whisper, to mention the silage, to raise the question of tainted feed, to shave enough doubt from the buyer's confidence that the price dropped below what Calla needed. She needed a buyer who did not know Cress, or a buyer who did not care. Thomas Avenel arrived in the Upper Niobrara country on the 9th of October, 1887, driving a wagon loaded with iron stock, coal, and a portable forge. He was 35, widowed, lean in the way that blacksmiths are lean, not thin but stripped, every excess burned away by years of standing over heat and swinging metal. He had come from Valentine to set up a seasonal smithing operation at McVeigh's store, repairing wagons, shoeing horses, and fabricating hardware for the ranches that were rebuilding after the winter. Calla met him because the draft mare needed shoeing. She led the mare to McVeigh's, where Avenel had set up his forge in a lean-to behind the store. The mare limped on the gravel. Avenel watched her approach, set down the hinge he was shaping, and walked to the horse without being asked. He lifted the left foreleg, the lame one, and examined the hoof. He pressed the frog with his thumb. He ran his hand up the cannon bone to the swollen joint. He set the foot down gently. "The shoe is wrong," he said. "Too flat. She's carrying weight on the outside edge, and the joint is compensating. I can shoe her to correct the angle, but she needs a week of rest after." "I cannot rest her for a week. I have hauling to do." "Then she will be lame for another year." Calla looked at the mare. The mare looked at Calla with the patient, resigned expression of an animal that had been lame so long it had forgotten what sound feet felt like. "Shoe her," Calla said. "I will find another way to haul." Avenel shoed the mare in 40 minutes. The work was precise. He heated each shoe in the portable forge, shaped it on the anvil with quick, accurate blows, and nailed it with a sureness that came from years of repetition. When he finished, he set the mare's foot down and watched her take 3 steps. The limp was still there, but changed, redistributed. The mare placed the left foot with less hesitation, as if testing a surface that had become slightly more trustworthy. "Give her the week," Avenel said. "The angle will do the rest." Calla paid him 75 cents, which was the standard shoeing fee, and started to lead the mare away. Avenel called after her. "You are the one with the pumpkin trench." Calla stopped. The sentence could have been mockery, could have been curiosity. It could have been the opening move of a man positioning himself for something. "I am," she said. "I heard about it from a freighter in Valentine. He said you fed cattle through the winter on buried pumpkins, and the whole district thinks you are either a genius or insane." "The district thinks what it likes." "The freighter thought you were a genius. He said a Frenchman helped you." "A Frenchman helped me. He died in August." Avenel was quiet for a moment. The forge popped. A horse stamped in the corral behind McVeigh's. "I'm sorry about the Frenchman," he said. "I knew men like that in Valentine. They carry the knowledge and nobody notices until they are gone." It was the right thing to say, not because it was sympathetic, but because it was specific. Avenel had identified exactly what Boudreau was: a carrier, a man whose value was in what he knew and what he gave, not in what he owned or where he stayed. Calla led the mare home. She did not think about Thomas Avenel again until 3 days later, when she realized she needed someone to haul the steers to market and had no one to ask. The sale happened on the 21st of October, and it happened not in Valentine, but at the Willow Knife place itself. The idea was Miriam's. If Calla brought the steers to Valentine, Cress would poison the sale. So bring the buyer to the steers. Let him see the cattle on the ground where they had been fed. Let him see the trench. Let him see the hay racks, the corral, the operation. Let the beef speak for itself the way Miriam had said it should. The buyer was a man named Thorson, a livestock agent for a packing firm in Omaha, who traveled the territory purchasing cattle for Eastern shipment. Thorson had no connection to Cress. He had heard about the Whitcomb operation from Vail, who mentioned it in a letter to the Broken Spurs Omaha owner, who mentioned it to Thorson at a cattleman's dinner, who decided that a ranch which lost 2 head in the worst winter in memory was worth seeing for himself. Thorson arrived on horseback, examined the 8 steers in the corral, checked teeth and hooves, felt the loin depth on 3 of them, and watched them eat from the rack. "What do you feed?" he said. "Hay and pumpkin silage." Silage. He said it without the inflection that Calla had learned to dread, no skepticism, no amusement, no "the word that means you're crazy" emphasis. He said it the way a man says a word he has encountered before, and filed away as interesting. "I have heard of silage dairies in New York," Thorson said. "Never heard of it for beef. The condition is good, not fat, but good. They will finish on grass by spring if you want to hold them." "I do not want to hold them. I want to ship them." He walked the corral one more time. $14 a head. 14. Calla did the arithmetic before the number finished echoing. 8 steers at 14 was $112. The banknote was $112. She said yes before her voice was ready, and the word came out hoarse, cracked, the sound of a woman who had been holding a number in her head for 3 months and had just heard it spoken by someone else. Thorson paid in bank drafts, $112. He loaded the steers onto a freight wagon he had hired from Valentine. The driver was Thomas Avenel, who had agreed to haul cattle as a side job and who handled the loading with the quiet competence of a man who knew animals and iron and the mechanics of getting heavy things from one place to another. Calla stood at the corral gate and watched the wagon pull away with the 8 steers that had eaten pumpkin silage through the worst winter in Nebraska history, and emerged on the other side carrying enough flesh to save the land they had been raised on. She held the bank drafts in both hands. $112, the exact amount of the note. She would have nothing left. No surplus, no cushion, no margin between survival and failure. But she would have the land. She would have the herd. She would have the trench. And she would have the knowledge that Boudreaux had given her and that she was already giving to others. That afternoon, she walked to Valentine, not rode, because the mare was still resting, and paid the banknote in full. The clerk stamped the document. Calla folded the receipt and put it in her coat pocket beside the yellowed clipping from the Illinois Farm Journal that still said ensilage in Nathan's penciled circle and asked Hendricks about this in his handwriting. She walked home in the dark. It took 5 hours. Her feet bled in her boots. She did not care. Kress found out about the sale on the 23rd, 2 days after Thorson shipped the steers. He learned the price, $14 a head, and he learned that the banknote had been paid in full, which meant his offer to purchase the note was now worthless. He came to the Willow Knife Place on the 25th, not to threaten, not to offer, to look. He stood at the corral fence and stared at the remaining 28 head, cows, heifers, calves, and the 2 bulls, with the expression of a man recalculating something he had been certain about and finding the new numbers intolerable. Calla did not come out to meet him. She was at the trench, cutting the face for the morning feed, and she saw him from the rise but did not walk down. Nell was beside her, loading the fork, and Calla told her to keep working. Kress stood at the fence for 10 minutes. Then he mounted his horse and rode toward McVeigh's. He did not speak to Calla. He did not need to. His presence was the message. I am still here. I am still watching. I have not conceded. But concession, when it came, would not be Kress's choice. It would be circumstances, the same force that had shaped every outcome in the Niobrara country since the winter began. Parked. The second winter, 1887 to 1888, was not as brutal as the first. The cold came later, the snow fell lighter, and the grass had recovered enough through the summer to give the cattle a better foundation going into December. But it was still a Nebraska winter, and a Nebraska winter tested everything. Calla's second trench held perfectly. The pumpkins she had grown in the creek bottom, smaller than the scavenged frost kills, but richer in sugar because she had let them ripen fully before cutting, produced silage that was darker, denser, and more acid than the first year's batch. She mixed it with rye, clover, and corn stalks from Ash Hollow Crossing, and the cattle ate it without hesitation because they remembered the taste from the winter before. 3 neighbors built trenches of their own. Rudd, the man who had written numbers in his notebook at the teaching day, dug a 20-foot trench and filled it with green corn, straw, and cull vegetables. It worked imperfectly, His seal was too thin, and he lost the top 12 inches to spoilage. But the material beneath was sound, and his cattle ate it through January and February. Miriam expanded her trench to 20 feet and filled it with pumpkin, garden waste, and hay sweepings. Her milk cow wintered without losing condition for the first time in the cow's life. The butter Miriam made in February was yellow and rich, the color of silage-fed milk, and she sold 3 pounds of it at McVeigh's for 20 cents a pound, a price that reflected quality, not desperation. Nell Dacey rebuilt her father's herd. Not with purchased cattle, the Dacey family had no money for cattle, but with 2 heifers that Calla gave her in exchange for a year's labor. Nell kept them on the Dacey quarter section, built a trench 12 feet long, and fed them through the winter with a mixture of weeds, rye, and pumpkin scraps. The heifers calved in spring. Nell had 4 head. It was the beginning of something that would grow slowly and with effort into a working ranch. But the beginning was 2 cows in a trench, and the knowledge that winter could be survived if you put the feed in the ground before the snow covered it. Cress's final reckoning came in February of 1888, and it came not because Calla defeated him, but because the same force that had nearly destroyed her, winter, destroyed him instead. He had purchased distressed cattle again. 30 head, bought cheap from a rancher near Gordon who was selling everything and moving to Oregon. Cress held them on rented grass south of the Niobrara, planning to resell in spring at twice the purchase price. He did not build a trench. He did not store feed. He did not buy hay in sufficient quantity because hay prices had risen after the previous winter, and Cress was a man who calculated margins, not survival. The February storm was not the worst of the season, but it was enough. 3 days of wind and snow, temperatures below zero, and cattle standing in a rented pasture with no shelter and no feed. Cress lost 19 of the 30 head. He found them in a draw, the same pattern, the same drifting, the same fatal convergence of cold and hunger and ice that had killed cattle by the thousands the year before. He came to Calla on the 4th of March, not to the corral fence this time, to the trench. Calla was cutting the morning face, 1.5 inches, the burlap folded back, the golden silage exposed to the cold air. Nell was loading the fork. The cattle waited at the rack. Cress stood at the edge of the trench and watched. He did not speak for a long time. The silence was different from any silence Calla had shared with him before. Not transactional, not calculating, not the silence of a man measuring how long to wait before the price dropped. It was the silence of a man standing in the wreckage of his own certainty and finding nothing beneath it. 19 head, he said. Calla did not respond. She cut the face. I held them on grass, and the grass was not there. She loaded the fork. She handed it to Nell, who carried it to the rack. Mrs. Whitcomb. His voice had changed. The Omaha coat was dirty. His boots were caked with mud from the draw where he had counted dead cattle. Show me how to pack it. The words cost him. Calla could see the cost in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands hung at his sides, instead of holding his hat in the gesture of practiced sincerity. He was not performing. He was asking. She could have refused. She had earned the right to refuse. This man had mocked her, threatened her, tried to buy her debt, spread rumors about her feed, and circled her ranch like a predator waiting for the weak moment that would let him take what he wanted. But Boudreaux's last words had been about this. Do not let them make this rare. A thing that saves feed must be common. Common meant everyone, even Cress. The trench needs to be 6 feet wide, Calla said. Deeper is better. The bottom layer is straw and brush for drainage. Cress stood still. Nell looked at Calla with an expression that said, "Are you certain?" And Calla ignored it, because certainty was not the point. The point was the cattle. The point had always been the cattle. "Wet material and dry material in layers," Calla said. "Pumpkins, green rye, clover, corn, anything with sugar, straw, chaff, dried grass, anything that absorbs. Pack with weight, seal with clay, 2 feet minimum." Cress listened. He did not take notes. He did not ask questions. He listened the way a man listens to instructions he intends to follow, because the alternative is counting dead cattle in a draw for the rest of his life. "When you open it," Calla said, "cut a narrow face, 2 inches, cover the face when you are done. The air is the enemy." "The air is the enemy," Cress repeated. He did not thank her. He did not apologize. He did not become a different man. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode toward the rented pasture where 11 surviving cattle stood in mud and waited for someone to decide whether they would eat. Nell said, "He does not deserve it." "The cattle do," Calla said. "The cattle always do." Thomas Avenel asked to court Calla in the spring of 1888, and he did it by building something. He arrived at the Willow Knife place with a wagon load of iron strap, oak planks, and a set of heavy bolts, and he said he wanted to build her a packing press, a hinged frame with a screw mechanism that could compress trench layers with more force and more consistency than horses or mauls. "I have seen them all," he said. "It works, but it misses the corners. The edges of the trench get less pressure than the center, and that is where the spoilage starts." "You have been looking at my trench." "I have been looking at your trench since October." The press took him 3 weeks to build. It was simple, a timber frame the width of the trench, with a long iron screw salvaged from a cider mill and a flat oak plate that descended when the screw turned. 2 people could operate it, one turning the screw with a bar, the other repositioning the frame along the trench after each section was pressed. They tested it together. Calla forked the pumpkin mash and straw into the trench. Avenel turned the screw. The plate descended, and the material compressed with a sound like wet cloth being wrung. A slow, heavy exhalation as the air was forced out and the layers bonded into a mass so dense that Calla's thumb could not penetrate it. "Better than horses," she said. "Horses step where they choose. The press goes where you put it." They worked side by side through the filling of the 3rd trench, the new one, larger than the first 2, 80 feet long and 7 feet wide, and the work became the language of their courtship. Not declarations, not gestures, labor. Shared labor, the kind that reveals a person's character through their hands and their patience and their willingness to do the same task 100 times without complaint. Avenel was quiet. He did not fill silence with words the way some men did, talking to cover the discomfort of proximity. He worked, and when he spoke, the words were about the work, the angle of the screw, the tension in the bolts, the way the oak plate warped after 3 days of moisture and needed to be replaced with elm. He also built a hinged plank for the trench face, a door, essentially, that could be opened for cutting and closed to seal the exposed silage between feedings. The door was Calla's idea. The hinges and latch were his. They married in the autumn of 1889, after 3 winters of shared work. The ceremony was at the Willow Knife place, witnessed by Miriam Pike, Nell Dacey, Irwin Pike, and 7 neighbors who had built trenches of their own. Vale sent a note from the Broken Spur that read, in its entirety, "Congratulations. Your husband should learn to pack corners." It was the closest thing to humor Ephraim Vale had ever produced. The years after the marriage compressed the way years do when the emergency has passed and the days are filled with the steady, accumulating work of building a life. Calla and Thomas expanded the Willow Knife Place. They bought an adjacent 80 acres when a neighbor moved to Oregon. They increased the herd to 55 head, not by buying cattle, but by keeping heifers and letting the natural increase build the numbers. They planted pumpkins every year in the creek bottom and experimented with other crops, turnips, mango beets, green corn, learning by trial which produced the best silage and which fermented poorly. Thomas built a timber-lined trench face, the improvement Boudreaux had wanted but never lived to see. The timber prevented the clay walls from crumbling during cutting and kept the silage cleaner. He also built a sled with iron runners specifically designed for hauling silage from the trench to the feed rack in winter, with sides high enough to carry a full day's ration in one trip. Nell Dacey became Calla's forewoman. Not officially, the title did not exist on a ranch of 55 head, but in practice, Nell managed the feeding operation while Calla managed the herd. By 1890, Nell had 12 head of her own on the Dacey Place and 2 trenches, and she was teaching the method to settlers who arrived in the Niobrara country, carrying the same confidence in open-range grass that had killed cattle by the thousands 4 years earlier. Miriam Pike started what she called a feed circle, a group of farm wives who pooled labor and materials for trench building each autumn. The circle had 9 members by 1891. They shared pumpkins, straw, equipment, and knowledge, and their collective cattle losses in winter dropped to less than a tenth of what the district had suffered in 1886. Vail retired from the Broken Spur in 1890. His last act as foreman was to oversee the construction of a timber-lined pit silo on the Broken Spur headquarters, the first permanent silo in the upper Niobrara district. He told the cowboys who built it that the idea came from a woman with $11 and 5,000 ruined pumpkins, and that if any of them laughed, he would fire them before the sound left their mouths. None of them laughed. The transformation that the Willow Knife Trench began was not unique to the Niobrara country. Across the northern plains, the Great Die-Up had forced the same reckoning, the recognition that open-range cattle could not be trusted to survive on grass alone, that winter feed must be stored and managed, that the old gamble of letting herds drift and hoping for the best was a gamble that the land and the animals could no longer afford. Ranches fenced, ranches harvested hay, ranches built shelters and windbreaks and water systems, and in a few places, more each year, ranches built silos and trenches and learned the principle that a woman in Nebraska had learned from a Frenchman, who had learned it from a dairyman, who had learned it from a book written by another Frenchman across the ocean. The knowledge traveled. It changed shape along the way, as knowledge does. But the principle remained, wet and dry, packed without air, sealed with clay or timber or earth, fermented by time and sugar, into something that kept animals alive when the grass was buried and the hay was gone. Air is the enemy. Pressure and time make acid. Acid preserves. It was not complicated. It had never been complicated. The complicated part was believing it before the proof arrived, when the only evidence was a clipping on a wall and a memory of hands pressing cabbage into a crock. Calla Whitcomb Avenel lived on the Willow Knife Place until 1914. She raised 3 children with Thomas. She wintered cattle every year using the method she had built in 1886, and she never lost more than 2 head in any single winter. She taught the method to more than 40 people, ranchers, settlers, farm wives, hired hands, who carried it to homesteads and ranches across the Niobrara country and beyond. In her later years, she kept a garden beside the creek bottom pumpkin patch, and visitors sometimes found her kneeling in the rows, pressing seeds into soil with the same deliberate pressure she had used on the trench, the same motion, the same patience, the same understanding that what went into the ground now determined what came out of it later. Thomas built her a rocking chair from elm and iron, and she sat in it on the porch in the evenings, watching the cattle graze the grass that came back stronger each year because the land had been managed instead of gambled on. The trench behind the shed, the original, the 60-footer, had been replaced twice, each time larger, each time better sealed. But the outline of the first one was still visible in the clay, a long depression in the rise where the ground had settled and never quite filled in. Children played on it. They jumped from the clay cap of the newest trench, the way children jump from any raised surface, for the joy of it, for the height, for the feeling of leaving the ground and returning to it. They did not know what was beneath their feet. They did not know that the mound they played on had once been the only thing standing between 38 cattle and a winter that killed thousands. They did not need to know. The knowing was in the ground, and in the method, and in the hands of the people who had learned it. Within 5 years of that first winter, no one in Ash Hollow Crossing laughed at coal crops. Frosted pumpkins, spoiled squash, green corn, and straw were no longer waste to be burned or ignored. Every autumn, wagons brought what once would have rotted in the fields to trenches dug on clay rises across the district. Calla taught them to pack, to seal, to smell, to cut, and to feed carefully. 43 people learned directly from her hands. Each one carried the method forward. Calla died in 1914 on the Willow Knife place, in the elm and iron rocking chair Thomas had built, on an October afternoon when the pumpkins in the creek bottom were turning orange and the first frost was 2 days away. She was 59 years old. Her hands were folded in her lap, and the clipping from the Illinois Farm Journal, yellow, torn, Nathan's pencil mark still legible, was in the pocket of her coat, where it had been every autumn since 1886. In January of 1887, the temperature in the upper Niobrara country had dropped below 22 degrees below zero. Ephraim Vale had ridden to the Willow Knife place through chest-high drifts and said, "I called it garbage. It is feed." Royal P. Kress had stood beside a trench on a clay rise and asked a woman he had tried to ruin to show him how to pack it, and Calla Whitcomb, who had bought 5,000 rotting pumpkins with 3 of her last $11, had pulled back a burlap sack, cut 2 inches of golden silage from the face of a 60-foot trench, and carried it through the snow to a rack where 37 cattle stood waiting. They ate. The air was the enemy. The discipline was the seal. And the woman who had buried what everyone else called garbage walked back to the trench in the cold, covered the face, and kept cutting,